All right, without objection, it is so ordered. This is our third session on The Unknown God by Deirdre, Carabine, which is Negative Theology in the Platonic Tradition, Plato to Eriugena. And this third session is on sort of the early part of the Christians, which also includes Philo, who is Jewish. So Philo of Alexandria, some of the other early Christian stuff are treated at the beginning of the next chapter on Gregory of Nyssa, and then a shorter chapter on Augustine. So those are the three that we're going to be talking about. Philo and Gregory chapters are the biggest ones. Gregory is probably the single biggest figure in this set, at least for this topic. Augustine might be just as big or bigger in Christian theology generally, especially in the West as opposed to the East, but he's less of a negative theologian, although D is trying to make out the case here that traditions from negative theology can be found in Augustine too, although they're not usually associated with it in the way they are with Gregory. But then also Philo, who again is not primarily thought of as a negative theologian, but just as a theologian. He's just right around the time of Christ and in this borderland area of the Old Testament in Greek translation, along with Platonism, both influencing his theology and that then influencing the other fathers. Anyway, that's just what the topic is. As usual, I'm going to do the round of typical questions. We had about a month, so I assume everyone did the reading, but you can tell me if you didn't. But did you do the reading? Any exposure to these people before, or are they new to you? I think might be some exposure to Augustine from several, but maybe not this side of Augustine, but just a level of previous exposure to the people, and then maybe also first impressions. So, Joe, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm trying to adjust my computer because I just had to set my computer up again last Friday, and not all the connections are properly hooked. I had a chance this morning, as is my wont, to do it all on the Sunday morning before the meeting, or at least to finish it on the Sunday morning before the meeting, and I did. Although, frankly, I had not actually opened the book until this morning because I had, as Czech knows, my house burned down on the 19th of October and all of my stuff was evicted, including my computer.
Ouch,
so
sorry to hear that.
Well, I wish you wouldn't say I'm sorry because you didn't cause it, and I would reserve that term for
fair enough. Well, yes, there you go. It's a misfortune, let's put it that way.
My Stoic philosophy presents me with a challenge, and what one does with a challenge is one overcomes it and focuses on it. And so I'm actually quite optimistic, and in as much as the homeowners insurance we have paid for a decade has come through, and unless they cheat us, which is possible, I will live here in Tempe, my new residence, for at least the next year. And then my home in Glendale will be totally remodeled, modernized, and ready for occupancy.
Gotcha.
Whereupon Emily and I proposed to put it on the market instantly and not go back in ourselves.
Gotcha.
And by that time, with the dollar shrinking and the people jumping out of the financial markets to buy land, it may be that I'm a much wealthier man after the fire than before, but this is yet to be determined, and nothing in the future is got a certainty to it.
So what about all of your household possessions and books and such?
Well, all of my books are still in the same place they have been, but they're all now covered with soot.
Gotcha.
And so the homeowners insurance part of the process is they take everything out, photograph it, index it, clean it, and de-smoke it, and then put it in storage until it can be delivered back to where it's supposed to go. And at that point, where it's supposed to go would be a different place. I'd have to get a storage locker or something at the end just before I can set them all up.
Gotcha.
But regardless of all that, I found the chapters that we have addressed, although I was puzzled. So we did supposedly get to Augustine through Augustine today?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, I didn't go that far because I thought that Augustine, I was dividing by 67 pages in a chunk.
Gotcha.
Read 67 up to the end of Gregory of Nyssa. And then I thought Augustine and the chapter after would be another 67 pages plus the epilogue. So
well, there's 2 chapters after Augustine. There's Pseudo-Dionysius and then Scotus Eriugena, then the epilogue.
but it's
Um,
67 pages if you measure it. And that's a nice bite. That's about the right size.
Yes,
But
yes.
nevertheless, please enter into Augustine today, and then we can.
And then we'll also talk about it next time if we have to, sure.
Correct. No, that's fine. Anyway, so that's the extent of my reading. I was very pleased with the discussion, especially when we get into Gregory of Nyssa. I think I've made it quite clear that I have no supernatural faith at all in the afterlife and things like that. And so for Nyssa, Gregory to be coming out and talking about the way in which he does not know what God is.
Yes.
The only thing that's different between him and me is that I also subtract the concept of being or ousia from it.
We'll definitely get to what ousia is or isn't for Gregory, because that's definitely core to him. No, there's lots of stuff to get to, but what about the Philo? Had you ever had any experience of Philo before?
No, I enjoyed the Philo chapter very much, and I thought that was an extremely valuable discussion about how Philo was trying to sort of bring together Plato and Moses through one common interpretation that could appeal to sort of Hellenistic Jew audiences and maybe non-Jews. But that was very nice. And you say Philo was writing around the first century?
Well, he's like 20s BC born, and he lives until like 40 AD. So he straddles the time of Christ on either side by 20 years. Older than and lasts longer than, so to speak, at least the traditional dates. Yeah, and so he's a very good index of what sort of contemporary thought was at the time of the founding of Christianity, especially in Hellenistic Alexandria and in the Jewish diaspora in Alexandria, right? So that's kind of a melting pot of Judaism and Greek thought and the Romans and everything else going on around that time. And also, so there are several of the church fathers that want to claim him for themselves as, he basically was prefiguring and agreeing with us, and others that see him as being fundamentally Jewish. The mainline Jewish tradition doesn't really want to claim him as one of their own because he's too close to Greek philosophy. The Greek philosophers don't really want to claim him as his own because he's too close to the Old Testament. So he's kind of this very influential figure in all traditions that no one really wants to claim ownership of or fully subscribe to. But he's a fascinating historical figure. Okay, so does that work for first impressions, or do you have other first impressions you want to get to before I go around?
First impressions, no. I went through the Philo and the chapter after Philo, basically reading the topic sentences of each paragraph and then reading the entire paragraph of the topic sentence hooked me. So that was speeding things up.
Yep.
But when I got to the last, 8 or 9 pages, I was reading every line because I was getting. By the way, whatever happened to Gregory of Nyssa, whatever he is named?
Nyssa. Sorry.
Now Nyssa is the one we looked at, but there's also a Gregory of Nazi N-A-Z-I something.
Yes, Nazenius, you're thinking. So the three great Cappadocian fathers are usually thought of as Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory Nazenius, and the three of them were all kind of in the same school that was instrumental in forming kind of the Orthodox creed that became the Nicene Creed after some of the councils, and all of them are students of or related to Basil. So Basil Gray is more of a political figure than a fundamentally philosophical or theological figure, although he's theologically important from the doctrine of the Trinity in particular, giving the kind of Platonic interpretation of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost business that became kind of orthodox. But Gregory is a deeper thinker in the same vein, a deeper student of Basil, but also, as Dee will point out, much more of a negative theologian, whereas Basil is sort of positive theologian trying to put forth a creed that he thinks that everyone is going to be able to understand and agree upon. But they're also in this period where Christianity is first becoming established, and it's also that it's first out in the open, and you're having synods under the auspices of the Eastern Roman Emperor, who is, inviting church leaders to grand councils where they're deciding on principles of the faith and so on, and getting an official imprimatur on all of that. But that's also a time of great controversy over some of these issues, especially Christology issues. So the Arian heresy, Donatist heresy, semi-Arianism, all these things about what is the actual relationship between Jesus and God, fundamentally. And the Basil Gregory of Nyssa school is a sort of major player in that whole set of debates. Gregory himself was arguing against the Arians, but then he got the Arians was kind of already condemned in his time, but then he was unseated from his position by Arians because there's some of the immediate successors of Constantine were Arian Christians. They were Christians, but they agreed with Arianism, and so they started deposing some of the bishops who were against Arianism. And there was a big fight about it, and eventually the emperor lost and the church people won, so to speak. And then his biggest stuff, controversial stuff at least, which is something like this against Eunomius, which Dee goes on about at length. Eunomius is not an Arian. The Arians have already been defeated by his time. He's considered a semi-Arian in the sense that there's some commonalities between the Arian position and his own, but he's trying to avoid falling into the condemned Arian propositions. But Gregory is thinking that his position will too easily slippery slope back into Arianism, something like that. And he's stumping for the Basil understanding of the Trinity instead. But anyway, all of that is related to the whole famous fight about the homoousia or homoiousia, the one iota, which we can get to when we get to that. But Gregory is still thought of as one of the most important theologians of Eastern Christianity, in the sense that the Greek Orthodox Church to this day considers the Cappadocian Fathers, including him and Basil, as being sort of founders of the creed that they still believe, and of the theological reasons why they believe it. He's at least as important in the East as Augustine is in the West. And they're contemporaries, they're around the same time. And when we say East and West here, I mean, obviously, well, not obviously, Augustine is in North Africa, as well as not simply in Rome, but the big dividing line is that Gregory is writing in Greek for a Greek audience, and the Eastern Roman Empire is still speaking Greek, and Augustine is writing in Latin for the Latin-speaking Western Roman Empire, which is breaking up under the onslaught of the barbarians. But anyway, that's sort of when we say East and West, we fundamentally mean writing in Greek, writing in Latin in this period. So the two people being covered in the second of the chapters read this time, and the third, which some of us read, are contemporaries, East and West, in that same period of the 4th century, basically. But as for Nazianzus, he's not nearly as important, I would say. He's as Gregory of Nyssa, certainly not in terms of his later influence or doctrines. In terms of the politics of establishing the position, Basil might be more important than either of them, but I don't think he's as intellectually deep as Gregory of Nyssa. That's partly my own assessment, partly just a traditional assessment of most of the just extent of their writings and so on among the fathers. Okay, but we'll raise lots of questions about that when we get to them. Chuck, do you want to give us did you do the reading first impressions, any of that kind of stuff? Previous experience as well.
I did most of the readings, that is to say, about half the chapter on Gregory of Nyssa when I had the call of the night, and Philo, but I didn't get to Augustine.
Okay, we might save Augustine for next time if that's general here, but yeah.
Well, we'll see. I'm certainly going to be interested in hearing if anybody has read Augustine, and if we do talk further about Augustine, to take pointers from the discussion. I've had only a general acquaintance to know that Philo existed. And so the chapter on him was interesting. I did know about the Cappadocian Fathers, and again, a general acquaintance with their effect on the development of Orthodox Eastern Christianity, especially. But this has been an intriguing set of readings for me. Sometimes little snippets catch my attention, like the notion that Plato might have received his wisdom by having spent some time in Egypt.
Mhm.
And by the time of Philo, and 3 centuries of Alexandria as a major city of the entire Greco-Roman world, and the capital of the Ptolemies, it's very understandable that people might think that the great figures from Solon on down in Greece would have come to Egypt and received wisdom from the ancient civilization on the Nile. But it occurs to me that Alexandria is not founded until after Alexander conquers it.
Of course.
And so Alexander comes to Egypt after the death of Plato. So
Yes. Well, yes. But Alexandria and the influence of Egypt are not synonyms, obviously.
no, they're not. But nonetheless, the question becomes, to what extent, indeed, would Plato, in his own lifetime, I mean, we have his 7th letter that says he seems to have gone to Sicily and played a part in the politics of the Syracusan monarchy. But I don't know that there's any sense that Plato himself might have gone to Egypt and spent any time.
Well, I don't know at any time, but I mean, I think there is some tradition that he did go there. The thing that comes across in the dialogues themselves is that Plato associates Egypt with religiosity. This is especially present in the dialogue of Phaedrus, where there's the myth of Thoth, the Greek god, the Egyptian god of writing and wisdom. The difference between writing and speech is a theme of part of the Phaedrus. There are places in Plato, in the dialogues that is, where not letters or something like that, where there's explicit reference to sort of what the common Greeks of his time associate with Egypt and Egyptology, right? It is this kind of a very priest-governed society of long tradition and hierarchy and religiosity. And I forget where it is, but one of the Greek priests says to Plato, "Oh, you tell me that these temples that you have are 500 years old," and my reaction is, in religion, you Greeks are nothing but children, right? Because their traditions are so long, and they think they have this long storied wisdom, and there's this sense in Plato that he's appealing to among the other Greeks, but he ascribes to it a little bit himself, that the old and ancestral is the piously venerable or something like that. So that's one of the traditions. There's also another tradition which may have a little bit more historical basis than that, that this civilization of Crete in particular was influenced by Egypt, and the mainland Greeks, especially Athens, have a quite complicated attitude towards the Cretans, especially Minos, and the story of Minos and the yearly tribute of Athens to Crete, and King Minos is an enemy of Athens, but he's also revered as one of the guardians of the underworld and judges of the dead in Greek myth. And Plato, or at least Socrates, shows quite a high opinion of Minos, which is somewhat scandalous to Athenians of this time, because he's like, remembered as an oppressive foreign tyrant to most of Athens. But anyway, so there are these ways in which the older traditions and myths about the older traditions are present in the Platonic dialogues themselves. he certainly doesn't say, oh, I learned everything about religion in Egypt, but he does present the Egyptians as themselves, thinking of themselves as having such long traditions that they know the ancients established stuff in religion in a way that the Greeks are, mere youngsters and innovators. That was also appealed to, looking around for one of these books. There was a tradition among some of the later Neoplatonists of appealing to this, people like Iambelicus, where they they're saying that they're finding the wisdom in the ancient oracles and beliefs of the Egyptians or the Chaldeans or the Assyrians. Sometimes all three. The Hermetic writings are obviously doing the same thing of taking the doctrine that they believe and putting it in the mouth of Thoth. Thoth is supposed to be the teacher, and they are all called Hermetic in the sense of Hermes only because Hermes is what the Greek god that corresponds to the god Thoth as the messenger between men and the gods. Anyway, so the point is there's a bunch of these other traditions out there. Some of those traditions are later than Plato, certainly, but Egypt being associated with religiosity is definitely there. The other thing that you find in Philo is he sometimes ascribes this not just to Plato learning from Egypt directly, but he claims that Pythagoras was enlightened by people who understood Moses or doctrines of Moses. So the intermediary there is supposed to be that Plato learned from the Pythagoreans, but the Pythagoreans learned from older Jewish traditions. This is something you find in Philo, that claim being made. I mean, what is the particular thing? What point of contact is being claimed? Pretty much just a single architect of the world who makes the world out of pre-existing matter. That's the point of contact that is claimed in Philo. So of course, Plato has this doctrine because in the Timaeus, the person who's propounding this doctrine is a Pythagorean. It's a Pythagorean doctrine. Plato got it from Pythagoras. Where did Pythagoras get it? Well, obviously he had heard of the Old Testament. He must have, because Pythagoras wouldn't have come up with this version of a story of the creation of the world by a supreme mind-like architect unless he knew about the Pentateuch, because that's where that doctrine was hundreds of years earlier propounded. That's the claim. That's not any claim that Pythagoras went to Israel to learn this stuff. It's just a coincidence of doctrines and priority in time claim that Pythagoras must have gotten this from Jewish wisdom, because it was there in Jewish wisdom centuries before Pythagoras. That's the kind of claim you get in Philo. Does that help?
But well, yes, thank you. The possibilities for cross-cultural or intellectual exchange are certainly feasible. I'm not sure that the Jews themselves ever left their promised land in any great number, not until Alexander founds Alexandria, and it becomes a great metropolis.
Well, I assume you're leaving out Babylon.
Yes, I'm leaving out Babylon in terms of it being a
I bring it up because it's a point where there is actual cross-fertilization, and maybe in both directions. The Jews go to Babylon under well, they go to Babylon, then Babylon is in captivity, I mean, and then when Babylon is conquered by the great king, right, he restores them to Jerusalem. But the guys that come back from exile, obviously this is like some cream of the nation that was exiled, not the common folk.
Right.
But they come back with a view of their mission, which is much more in line with what Cyrus wants them to do, and may have been influenced by similarities. Cyrus is inclined to release them not only because they were brought into captivity by the people he just conquered, So for a purely politic reason, that might be, upset the previous apple carts, restore the previous exiles, it will gain you their favor, just a politic reason. But there's also he says he wants them to go back to restore their worship of their one high God, which Cyrus thinks is like Ahura Mazda, because at that time, the Zoroastrianism is the official state religion of the Persians who are doing all this. Anyway, the point is that there is times when the Jews do leave Palestine, and they do have cross-fertilizations, but it's not in the form of a great library at Alexandria where all the scholars of the world come to study. It's much more political than that, so to speak. If you're looking at sort of broader cultural emanation things, Egypt certainly influenced Mycenaean Greece heavily. That's the Minos connection, or the Cretan connection as well. There's lots of parallels between elements of Greek religion and other religions of the Near East, and general Indo-European religions for that matter. Some of the later cults in Egypt, sorry, not in Egypt, in Greece or Thrace for that matter, look like they're Egyptian imports at the level of popular religion. But so there is cross-fertilization / assimilation of the religious nature like that. How much of that actually also goes to philosophical stuff? Don't know. Usually the usual assumption is not very much, but some of these philosophical traditions do speak of this kind of wandering around the Mediterranean to learn wisdom from each place. There certainly are such stories connected with Pythagoras, but there's all kinds of stories connected with Pythagoras which probably aren't true. But Pythagoras, in the stories about Pythagoras, goes from the Pillars of Hercules to India, and from the Caucasus to the Nile to learn his wisdom from the four corners of the world before he comes back and teaches them in Greece and Italy, right? And those are traditions told about Pythagoras, but hundreds of years after his actual time. So who knows how historical any of them are. The reason people are telling those stories is because that breadth of travel is seen as a sign of the depth of the traditions. When anyone sees a parallel between some aspect of someone's teachings and some aspects of a teaching characteristic of another place, they want to look for an explanation like that to assimilate them. In the case of Pythagoras, his reincarnation doctrines are associated with India, right? So he must have traveled there. He wouldn't have believed such things if he did. The psychosis doctrines would not have happened without the Indian influence, something like this. It seems to be the thought. But that doesn't mean it's true in the time of Pythagoras. It just means that later people thought that such explanations for parallels in thought were plausible. And I think that's all that's really going on in Philo's case. I don't think he has any particular reason for thinking that Plato or Pythagoras actually learned these doctrines from Moses. There's like basically no evidence of that whatsoever. Instead, it's just, I see this tradition, I see that tradition, I see a parallel between them. This one predates that one by centuries, therefore the one that predated it must be the one that influenced the other. That seems to be the level of reasoning involved. Which is, a wild supposition from our later historical points of view. It tells us more about the person being able to see the parallel or think that there's a parallel than about the actual cross-cultural fertilization process that may or may not have been going on.
I also noticed that in a couple of citations from Philo, the work that is cited is given in Latin, which implies to me that some of the original Greek writings of Philo might have been lost in the Greek and preserved only in a later Latin version, which is also interesting because although,
Go ahead.
It's not long after Philo's life that Egypt falls into the personal possession of Octavian, it would no doubt still take some time before the writings of a Greek like Philo would have become so well known in the West that a Latin version would have been created. And it is now being the one that's being cited. I thought that was an interesting
Go ahead.
tidbit, as it were. There are at least a couple where Philo's citation, according to D, is from a Latin work. So
There certainly are extensive collections of Philo's works in Latin in the Middle Ages, right? And if you want a kind of complete Philo, it's most likely a place you're going to get it. But most of those are translations, often medieval translations from his original Greek, and there are Greek versions of most of the manuscripts. But does that mean all of them? Probably not, because I mean, so this is my little works of Philo, right? It's that big, okay, but it's that big because it's 4 columns like a Bible in tiny print, right? And that 4 columns like a Bible in tiny print runs 900 pages. So these are pretty thin pages too. There's an essay in here on drunkenness, 2 on the life of Moses, 1 on Abraham, 1 on Joseph, on dreams, on rewards and punishments, every good man is free, the contemplative life, apology for the Jews, fragments on providence, allegorical interpretation of the entire Pentateuch, allegorical interpretation of questions and answers on Genesis, things about Canaan as exiles, the unchangeableness of God, on husbandry. He's a prolific writer, right? So I would not be surprised if one of these, if the essay on the confusion of tongues was in Latin rather than Greek, it would be like apropos or something. But I don't know. But he's not an obscure writer in the sense of people only track down one of his manuscripts in 15th century Florence because of the rage about antiquities. He was well known not only in the period of the Fathers, but in the Middle Ages, with extensive compilations of his works. Obviously not printed, but circulating.
So he was known to Augustine as well.
Probably. I don't think we have. This is another one of those cases where it's the text parallels that are the basis of it. Augustine himself doesn't quote too many people other than Plato and his immediate teachers, but is clearly influenced by much more than that. But it's not like he's giving footnotes for claims he's making like D would. It's not a scholastic tradition like that at the time. Sorry, check.
The discussion about Philo is interesting, especially as a cross-cultural intellectual fertilization, and maybe I think even in introducing Philo, Dee makes the point that while there is a connectivity to the overall subject of the unknown God through Philo and his writings that she's citing, there was still a disjunct aspect in that Philo doesn't seem to contribute directly to negative theology or to some of the other writers in the Christian tradition, because he is so much a Hellenized Jew and focused on the Old Testament, so that it's sort of in passing that the later writers who are struggling with how to define God and how to understand God will go back to Philo to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent, because of his acceptability to a certain extent due to his acquaintance with Plato, and his acceptability to another different extent because he is Jewish and is focused on the texts of the Pentateuch and the Old Testament. I did find it interesting in particular that there seems to have been a good deal of focus on the I am description.
We'll definitely get to that.
Uh,
Definitely get to that. It's
Right.
certainly the most important thing, point of contact here. I just want to jump in for a second. I mean, there are plenty of the church fathers, Christian church fathers, that cite Philo without a qualm, and especially for his interpretations of Genesis and things like this. Philo is the inventor of the allegorical method of interpretation of the Bible as practiced by most of the fathers.
Really?
Yes, he didn't invent allegorical interpretation. He got it from the Stoics, but they were only applying it to Homer. Applying it to the Old Testament, he's the original, and they're copying him, quite a bit. So to say, here's the literal meaning, but that's not the important part. The important part is the allegorical sense behind this meaning. And by the way, it just so happens that allegorical meaning that is behind the text is the place where the mind of Moses and the mind of Plato exactly coincide, right? That's just a coincidence, because they're agreeing because they're both agreeing with the truth, right? But that sort of method of sometimes quite strained allegorical reading to find the deep philosophical lessons in a passage, in every passage for that matter, in the Old Testament, is something that Philo is doing on every page. Did he get some of that from the Jewish Torah traditions before him? Maybe, but maybe not, because he wasn't that acceptable to them. So I think he's pretty much his originator. He's learned a bunch of this allegorical interpretation methods applied to Homer and Hesiod, and what's the point of this myth that when the Stoics were rationalizing the old Greek thought and reading metaphysical lessons into stories about the Homeric or Hesiodian gods, right? The Stoics were doing a lot of that around his time, or 200 years before, 100 years before. He knows all those methods, and he reads the Old Testament that way. The Old Testament in Greek, by the way, the Septuagint. But so he'll go on for 30 pages about the first 7 days of the creation, and he'll be linking it up with everything under the sun, if you pardon the expression. But so that's a tradition of how to read the Bible that did begin with him, but certainly didn't end with him. And plenty of the other church fathers are also doing it, especially when they're engaged in controversy with the pagans, so to speak. If you're talking about a Justin Martyr or a Clement of Alexandria arguing against the pagans about their myths, right? They will be able to reach to Philo and his methods to show similar interpretations of their book and to the Greek myths, and to show points of commonality and then claim points of superiority, and so on. So that is very heavily used by the Christian fathers. So I'm just reacting to the idea of, is there something only marginally acceptable to the Christian thinkers about Philo because he's Jewish? I would say no. He's very heavily accepted, and you get people as late as this 200s AD who are claiming that obviously Philo was a Christian. But even though we know that, there's no sign that he was, but they say, he understands these things the same way we understand these things, so we can claim him as one of ours. And you get that down to the 200s. I don't know if that helps on just the history aspect of his reception.
It does. It does. And also, it's my understanding that, with the loss of Jerusalem, the Babylonian exile, you began to have a synagogue tradition growing up in the exile period, which then, when the exiles return to the promised land, they bring with them, and that begins a tradition of study that ratifies the notion that prophecy has been withdrawn from Israel, and that now the pathway to understanding God and understanding our faith is by study and argumentation. So I'm not sure when the Mishnah or the Talmud begin to be codified in writing, but I'm assuming it's in that period after the exile is over with and into the period.
I think it's normally thought of as I think it's most normally thought of as later. Well, after that, it's after the destruction of the Second Temple that really all becomes fully codified. When the diaspora happens after the destruction of the Second Temple, there's and then there are gatherings of lots of ancient traditions at that time, but the actual codification of those elements of the before then you have the law, the wisdom writings, and the prophets, right? But the Mishnah collecting around all that and being handed down as critical additional stuff only gets codified into actual, this is the received book of that things well after the destruction of the Second Temple. So that's well after the time of Philo. It's in several hundreds AD that actually all gets written down. I see Craig nodding. He probably knows this history at least as well as I do, probably better. Do you want to jump in there, Craig, with some dates or comments on that?
Just the mix of how things tend to happen. As I was reading about Philo, one of the books I'd ordered quite a while back finally came out, and it's called After Jesus, Before Christianity. It's from the Jesus Seminar people, and it's a historical exploration of the first 2 centuries of the Jesus movements, plural movements, for 200 years. There was no New Testament when Philo was around. There was probably, he was not even aware of writings that hadn't been written yet, which would be all the Gospels, all the letters of Paul. So the fact that he's only dealing with the Jewish scripture is just the fact of a historical situation he was in. The temple destruction, 70 AD, he was already dead after that too. So the work towards the newer Judaism, the priestly interpretation and such, is later than Philo. And one of the things that they harp on a lot in this book is the ways in which, especially within Christian traditions, they want to read back into that time frame their favorite interpretation of what was happening in those first 200 years. And the Jesus Seminar is basically saying there's no history to support that this was just a lot of loosely affiliated different groups that were following the anointed one, with the emphasis on the anointed one and not the word savior, but anointed. Very Jewish tradition there. So there's no surprise to me at all. That was a great help as I started digging into Philo, to put it into the perspective of this was before Christianity really even formed.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are no texts of Christianity yet. But the point, I think that I think Jack probably knows some of that aspect of it reasonably well. The real thing is just understanding when the if I can put it this way, the scholarship Judaism really sets in. There's a tradition of scholarship Judaism before the destruction of the Second Temple and before the time of Philo, including a intellectual life in Alexandria, but it's focused on translating the Old Testament into Greek, producing the Septuagint, and it's not really going beyond at that point the law, the wisdom writings, and the prophets. Those are the 3 things that they want to have in that compilation into Greek, that everyone's going to study in Greek, and the tradition of having the rulings of every teacher, every rabbi, written around all that to interpret it is later. And Philo is doing some of this allegorical interpretation for the deeper meaning in the text of the Septuagint, right? Well before there is any Mishnah that he could be contrasting it with, or that he could be just disagreeing with. He's not saying here's my reading and it should replace the Mishnah, right? There is no Mishnah for it to replace yet. But Yeah, it's a fine question. I think that the part of that, which is, I agree with Craig that the first 200 years of Christianity are much more amorphous than tradition sometimes likes to present it. And we saw that when we study all the Gnostics about how many different things were going on and what a fertile period it was with things Christian, semi-Christian, and different varieties of Christian. It's also not only down to this time, but well into the time of Gregory of Nyssa, the time of all the great early heresies, the Marcion controversy and the Donatist controversy and the Arian controversy, and all those things are going on, which means that Christianity is still forming, right? Well into the 300s. Okay, but in all that, the sort of traditional understanding is to go read the church fathers. That's why people look at the church fathers. They're the people who were there on the ground fighting the fights that were being fought then. They're the ones who are going to name a heresy was running around. So you'll find what's his name, an Irenaeus, right, railing against the Gnostics in the 200s, and so that the Gnostics were around and that there were Christians around who didn't like them and thought that this was, that this is that reason for disliking them. Justin Martyr will mention Marcion and so on, right? So the one of the reasons the fathers are important is to establish some of that history, not because they're historians, but because they're controversialists in the middle of that controversy while the forming is actually happening. And they give you frontline testimony, usually from only one side of the debate, but for the debate going on. One of the reasons we read the Gnostic religion book is because we have some of the texts of the other side of some of those debates too, and just understand that whole environment. And especially from my point of view, some of the Greek philosophical background of all of that, right? Because it's all happening in the atmosphere of what we saw in the first half of this book, of where Middle Platonism turning into Neoplatonism and all this stuff. There's a metaphysical and religious side to contemporary, especially Greek philosophical culture at the same time. And that's also what we see in Philo. That's why Philo can see all these parallels between, as he sees it, between Plato and the Old Testament in that same period. Okay, I want to let Czech finish up with his first reactions, then we get to Craig for his all.
That's all my first reaction.
Okay, sure. Okay, so Craig, did you get reading exposure to these people before, especially the negatives? And did you get to Augustine? Should we just leave him for next time? And then first reactions.
Okay, I did read all of it, including the chapter on Augustine.
Okay.
I thought the Augustine chapter was short and quick. It was fairly straightforward. There's more you could do with Augustine, but not what she wanted to do with it, in some sense. The thing
it is short, but she also has a very definite take. I'm not sure that it quite holds up, but we can get to that.
Yeah. That's kind of the thing. It's her agenda that comes out in that chapter very clearly.
Yeah.
So the thing that I needed most to do was to go back and reconstruct chronology, because that became critically important when she was talking about Philo getting stuff from Plotinus. She got it backwards, that Philo was sort of preceding Plotinus, and there are a couple of times that her language was could be misconstrued into an incorrect chronology. So I had to go back and really reconstruct that chronology from Philo through the time frame, which is why the book on the early days of Christianity fit into that so well. To really see Philo as Jewish, and to see his standpoint that now he's not going to get into an argument with Paul because the two didn't even know each other existed.
Right.
Two different parts of the world though. So some of that kind of stuff really helped in terms of the first impressions. I've been around a little bit of Philo before, and less of the Cappadocian fathers, to put them all into the one lump.
Yep.
Some kind of history. Again, rethinking that given the readings I'm doing now on in the first 200 years. Mm-hmm. One note that you were talking about that came back to keep reminding me: in high school, the pastor of the church that I went to said the most important thing you can remember is that a heresy is a truth carried too far. that it's not a falsehood, it's a truth carried too far. And that's been with me now for, 50 plus years, in the sense of they're pushing something that has a little bit of foundation in it, but they pushed it a little bit too far and they made too much of it, rather than it's just flat out wrong. And and that helped, even as I was reading Jonas and the controversies that Jonas brought up, that what was the element of truth that was there, and how did they misconstrue it or make too much of it, rather than were they just flat out wrong? Because in the argument against this, you can get the sense that there's a right and a wrong, but no, there's almost shades of right, shades of wrong, and where do we end up on the spectrum?
So I'm gonna interrupt just for a second, 'cause I partly agree with that. There's another version of what many of the heresies are, which is agrees partly with that, which is it's leaving something out. It's an exaggeration or a one-sided truth because it's leaving out some context and picking one side of something. True for many heresies, not necessarily all of them. And some of the things that passed for heresies then might be just Reformed theology now. There's plenty of places there where later theological controversy, especially in the Reformation and after, revisited some of these things. We saw when we did this stuff on Pascal that there are cases where modern Protestants agreeing too much with Augustine are seen as unorthodox by the church in the 16th century, sorry, the 17th century, because the heat of controversy has moved where the pain points are, and insisting on this doctrine versus that doctrine, has a very different feel in different cultural contexts. Anyway, I just want to get out there that the fact that something was considered a heresy at the time doesn't decide all the theological questions about it. But yes, it's often a truth pushed too far or a one-sided thing. Sometimes the reaction to it has those characteristics as well. But yeah, sorry, when you finish your reactions.
Yeah, so that was a great part of the sense. That's exactly what's coming from, because I keep thinking about the current evangelical Christian versus progressive Christian arguments that are going on right now, and the tendency towards panentheism within progressive Christianity, which could be labeled as a heresy back in the days, but it's not as far from Augustine as people would want it to be. It's definitely not special revelation. It's not pure theism, which is some of what the arguments that were even in these chapters we're dealing with. Is it all about what happened in history that we take as revelation? Is that it, or is there something else there that we can come to see, whether it's through the intellect or through exploring our understanding the basis of love? To go to Augustine, that intrigued me, that some of these arguments, the shades of truth that are argued back and forth, really do wax and wane through the cultural traditions and are still in some respects present today, as we discuss much of what we're dealing with.
Yes, and I would even say that for some of these things would be more live controversies still today if people were as awake and aware as they were then. And sometimes people don't realize that they're recapitulating an old debate because it never occurs to them, right? That they don't. What I'm trying to say is some of the contemporary things don't have the depth of some of these originals. That's not always the case, but it is not the case that all modern controversies are completely informed about the old ones. Not even remotely.
Yeah, as I read the readings on the primacy of consciousness and the current trend to substitute the word consciousness for God because it's more politically acceptable, I wish that some of these psychologists had a little philosophy behind them, because they're arguing the same shit.
Yes.
It's
So this is a great segue, because one of the things that I'm going to point out is there's a kind of a limitation in the presentation of these topics here by this author, that she's trying to give you the take of what did they have to say about negative theology specifically, right? But often you can understand their positions more if you put in the positive side as well, because they have, some of these guys in particular have very different positive conceptions of God. And if you don't know them, right, all of the different ways in which they used a piece of negative language can just be misleading, right? She does give the provisos of, Augustine is not usually thought of as primarily a negative thinker, or Philo is not primarily a negative theologian. She doesn't say those things about Gregory of Nyssa, right? But all three of them have positive doctrines of these things, not just negative doctrines of these things. Gregory is probably the one with the closest to having negative doctrine about these things, but if you dig a little deeper, you'll find out the reason why he has all those negative notions is because of a positive notion he has, right? So one of the things I want to do when we get to the actual subject matter is go through the actual differences in the positive conceptions that each of these people have, not just the different ways in which they are part of a tradition of negative theology. Okay, and that's
so that's pretty much my first impressions. And as we get into
Yes.
deeper into the particulars, I think that'll come up. But I tended to agree. Sorting out her agenda, sorting out the way in which she lumped people together based on thought, and kind of left the chronology a little bit hanging. I had to go back and reconstruct chronology to put it back into a different perspective. And
yes,
so that
I think it helps.
With it.
I think it partly helps to think of this as like a dissertation kind of exercise where, she's going to go through all of the people in the corpus she's supposed to look at, and she's going to find all the ways in which they're talking about her topic, right? What does X have to say about negative theology? And then she'll bring out those aspects. That necessarily means all the other aspects of them, go into the background. She's not trying to give a survey of each of these people. She couldn't fit it into one book. But along the way, she also has her own dog in the fight, so to speak. She thinks of negative theology as a insightful and a semi-rationalist way of approaching theology, which ends in the possibility of a mysticism she finds attractive, even though she's not practicing it or something like that. And she's going to read that into these folks. So if she finds a way in which there's an aspect of negative theology in Augustine, she'll think that's a good thing, right? It's not just that she has to cover it because it's part of her topic. She's looking for it because she thinks it is a good thing to have. And it's especially noteworthy in that chapter that there's places where she will talk about things where Augustine is just talking about some aspect of divinity not being material or sensible, and she will think, okay, then that's negative theology. Not that simple. So it's just saying we're in the noumenal realm or something like that. Anyway, I want to switch over to the.
I tended to agree that it read like a doctoral thesis with A.H. Armstrong as her thesis advisor.
Yes, or who she wished was on the committee, right? Yes, exactly.
Or who she wishes, yeah.
She wrote it for him,
Exactly.
So we're about to segue into the positive content, but I just see Sam just joined us. I want to know if you want to, you're perfectly happy to have you lurk, but if you want and ask questions, but if you want to jump in and tell us, did you manage to do the reading, any previous exposure to these people, or first impressions? We just got done with that with everyone else, and we're going to go on to the content next. But if you want to get your word in on any of those things, feel free.
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry joining late. Actually, I wasn't able to, but yeah, I'll probably hopefully just listen. Thanks.
That's fine. Okay. So the part of what you said, Craig, where you mentioned the consciousness bit, this triggered me to think this is a great segue, and the reason is for Philo in particular. She doesn't go into this because she's not covering people's positive conceptions of things, but in Philo, in particular in his stuff on Genesis, there's a very clear positive doctrine about what he means by God, right? And it's not just the being stuff that you get in Exodus, and it's certainly not a Platonic idea of the good, and it's not even a Parmenidean one, right, out of the Parmenides. It's something more like the mind of the whole. And he gives a picture of his interpretation of Genesis along the lines of Timaeus, where there's some architect making the world, right? And the preconception of what the world should be in the mind of the architect before the world is made, he's going to assimilate to the Platonic ideas. And that's going to be very, very close to Timaeus. So the ideas are the architect of the universe's thoughts before the construction of the actual physical universe. But then what that means is that the role or slot that is reserved for God in this is not even primarily the maker of the world. It's the mind in which those thoughts occur. And he's even explicit about this, that he reasons by analogy that pre-existent thought-like things need a mind in which they are thought. And that mind in which they are thought is what he is calling God. That's straight Philo. Now, there are places in the chapter where she gets confused about this because he's going to distinguish between the thoughts and the mind thinking them. And she's going to think that because he's saying something goes beyond the thoughts or goes beyond the being's thought, that it is beyond thought or beyond being. And that's not what he's saying. He's just an idealist theist for which the consciousness of God is the whole, right? The beings are the thoughts of God, and the mind of God is, oh, sorry, the mind of the whole is what he's meaning by God, something like that. Where does he see echoes of this in the Greek tradition that lets him say things like Plato got this from us? The answer is he sees it, some of it in Pythagoras, he sees some of it in Anaxagoras, that the first is mind. There are places, you know, if people don't know, was the teacher of Socrates, so to speak. So that mental, it's a mentalist conception of the deity, right? As a mind in a noumenal realm. Now, the heroic part of this is going from the fact that something in the realm of sense needs a mind to think it, to thinking that in the noumenal realm that is also necessary. That's the part that you wouldn't necessarily get in Plotinus, and you wouldn't necessarily get in the Parmenides, right? Where they'll be reasoning about the one or being or something. In the case of Philo, its basis is a clear reasoning by analogy, and the analogy is the architect of making the city. The architect dreaming what the city should be before the city is made. That's the explicit metaphor in Philo's understanding of Genesis and Timaeus both. Okay, so in terms of positive conception, mind of the all is the positive conception going on here. And because of that, it's not corporeal, it's not in the realm of sense. It is all these other characteristics that you get in Platonic thinking or in Parmenidean thinking are still there. There's an outside timedness of it because time as we know it is supposed to be part of and internal to the perceptible creation. But it is definitely a thinking mind. It is not just a principle of being or the idea of the good, right? And Philo will even say that he will even interpret the verses that talk about man being made in the image of God is simply a reference to the fact that man has a mind. The microcosm macrocosm is man is the mind microcosm, God is the mind macrocosm, the God of the universe, sorry, the mind of the universe. So the point of contact of the image of God notion is purely mindliness, right? Therefore, it is mindliness which is divine in man. So all of this is very clearly there in just Philo's positive conceptions, leaving out anything negative. And there's plenty of things in her chapter on Philo, where she's entirely right to call this the escape to the uncreated, entirely right to call this a God that is hidden in the sense of anything that is sensible in this world or transcendent, but no more transcendent than the ideas, no more transcendent than the noumenal realm in Plato, right? And that is something that Dee doesn't always get. Is there anything in Philo where he's trying to explicitly assimilate any of his stuff to the notion from the Republic of the good being beyond being? No, not a lick of it. Is there anything in it which is like the Platonian one being higher than nous and higher than being? No, just not there in Philo, right? His nous or God mind or mind of the all and being are on the same level of equation that you get in the second tier of the Platonian hierarchy, but that's his idea of God, right? You also get in Philo something which this was also very important for the later Christians and also for especially understandings of John Gospel. There's an idea of the logos, right? He has the logos or reason of God as a third governing thing. I don't know if it's the third governing thing or second governing thing, some other governing thing, right? Yeah, he has a logos notion, and this logos notion can feel a little bit like a second person in the Godhead. And you could say mind of the all, being, logos. That logos is also just very close to what the Stoics were thinking of as providence or the governing power of the material universe, right? So Philo is a point of contact between Stoicism, Middle Platonism, and what's about to become Johnian Christianity, right? In this respect. And logos thinking, if I can put it that way, is the thing which, you know, runs like a red thread through those. And logos thinking then gets becomes one of the critical parts of the church fathers thinking about the Trinity, right? But in Philo, logos is more of a principle. It's basically not personified, never personified. But something like the order, the ascertainable order in the sensible world, the world that can be perceived by the senses, right, as being a logos, that's like the divine reason in things. This divine reason in things is the footprints of God in the creation, right? The fact you can tell that it's created, and therefore there's mindliness in it. You can tell that it's mind created because it's architecturally, you know, so that's the claim, right? And then all of that being traced to, so there was some architect mind that foresaw what it would be before it was created, just like the mind of the architect foresees the plan of the city. Okay, so in all of that, what is the I am that I am going to be for Philo? The answer is it's going to be it's not going to be simply an idea of God as the idea of being, so that the being of the beings is radiated to them by the principle of being. You get that in plenty of other being theologies. He's kind of got that too, but there's this much more idealistic, theistic version of it, right? The being that this principle is radiating into things is their thoughts in the minds of God, right? That's what it means to be, to Philo. So, and then there's elements of this which you can see echoed in some of the Eastern religious traditions, you know, the dreams of Vishnu kind of view. My point is that a theistic idealism is a recurrent metaphysical position that you find in multiple traditions, and Philo is clearly just stumping for that as how to read the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a theistic idealism, and Pythagoras can be read as a theistic idealism, and therefore he's going to also read Plato as a theistic idealism and put an equal sign between them and say, of course, these things all agree because it's the truth. So that's where Philo is on this positive conception of God thing. Before we get down to anybody else's, like Gregory or Augustine's, questions about that Philo view? Does it make sense to anybody? Do you understand how I'm distinguishing them from people like the Neoplatonists and such that we read before?
A matter of, since I'm not really that familiar with Platonism, where do you draw the line chronologically between Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism?
Neoplatonism is usually thought of as starting with Plotinus. So That's the 200s, but 200s AD. So it's relatively late. People call it Middle Platonism if it's after the initial skeptical period of the academy. So in the time of Plato himself, his immediate successors are just skeptics. They're trying to not have a dogma. The only thing they know is that we know nothing, that sort of position. As soon as they're under fire from other doctrines, they're Stoics or Epicureans or Aristotelians, they realize that it's not quite enough to just say they know nothing, because then everyone will go to the other schools where they actually know things, and they start having positive doctrines themselves. That's where Middle Platonism begins. So the bookends are when they start saying they have positive doctrines, not just negative skepticism. That's when it begins, and it ends with Plotinus turning it into Neoplatonism. Everything in between is called Middle Platonism. Does that help?
Yes. And then Neoplatonism has another transformation later on.
To a degree, yes. Neoplatonism, the first version of it in Plotinus is just Plotinus and maybe his student Porphyry, just trying to interpret Plotinus. That's sort of the early version of it. It takes a kind of semi-magical or theurgy turn with people like Iambelicus. And then by the time of Proclus, that's sort of mature or final Neoplatonism, it's become something which is trying to assimilate large parts of the pagan understanding. That includes Aristotle, it includes the other Greek philosophers, it includes the Greek mythological traditions, it includes the mythological traditions of Egypt and Assyria and Chaldea and so on. The point is, it's trying to be sort of a general wisdom of the ancient world. That wasn't yet there in Plotinus, right? Plotinus was really following in a particular Platonic tradition. It didn't have this myth reinterpreting and semi-magical component that you get with people like Iambelicus. And Proclus isn't trying to peddle that religious side of things too hard, but he also is not quite running away from it. But he's trying to assimilate, he's trying to reduce the amount of disagreements in the pagan tradition to zero, to present a united pagan understanding of metaphysics, religion, and philosophy in the late classical world, by that point, actually in opposition to Christianity, among other things. So that's kind of, so that last version is associated with Proclus. There's none of that controversialness in Plotinus. Plotinus, the only controversy stuff you have is he writes against the Gnostics. He doesn't write against the Christians. He only writes against some of the Gnostics. But Proclus, gets in debates with people like John Philoponus on the creation of the world. He's arguing for a pagan position against the Christian position from his own point of view. Does that help?
And so, but that's still technically Neoplatonism or not?
Yes, that's still Neoplatonism.
And then when the Emperor Justinian closes the University of Athens,
Yes.
and solidifies the orthodoxy
Yes.
of Christianity in the empire.
Yes.
What he's suppressing is that last stage of Platonism.
Yes, basically, it's basically the Proclean version of Neoplatonism that that leaves Athens and goes running off to Haran in Mesopotamia, and then the Muslims sweep in. But yes, the philosophical tradition at Athens kind of ends with, if not Proclus himself, the successors of Proclus that are basically the same sort of position.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Just a quick aside. Curious for further stuff. With the Neoplatonism taken off to the area that it takes off to, you're looking at roughly 100 years later that Muhammad shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And Islam starts developing. Is there a tie to the work that the Neoplatonism and such brought into that area, or?
Yes,
or not?
Specifically the circle around Al-Kindi starts translating a lot of the Greek works under the direction of Nestorian Christian theologians. So Nestorian Christians who can read Greek are teaching Al-Kindi and his students how to read enough Greek to translate these things into Arabic. But these things they want to translate are things like the Theology of Aristotle, which isn't really Aristotle, but it's sections from Plotinus, though they don't know it. And it's things like the Book of Causes, which is seems to be Cliff Notes to Porphyry. So a bunch of these Greek Neoplatonic works get translated into Arabic, often with either no ascription to who they're from or to ascription to authors they're not actually from, but that are ascribing to them to this late classical pagan consensus, so to speak, right? So and things like Proclus's Elements of Theology also sort of get translated there and so on. They also, a little bit later, get some of the less assimilationist stuff. They get some of the straighter Plato and the straighter Aristotle direct. And by the time of someone like Ibn Sina, all of those different traditions have been assimilated, more or less. And so you get a kind of mature medieval Islamic philosophical position in Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he's called in the West, that has assimilated a bunch of Neoplatonism, a bunch of Aristotle, a bunch of Plato, a bunch of Nestorian Christian theology, and a bunch of Islamic theology into sort of one position about God, which is close to being God as being, by the way. But as we saw in some of the stuff on the Etienne Gilson stuff on Being and Some Philosophers, but that's sort of the Avicenna position. It then gets attacked inside Islam by Ghazali as being too Greek and insufficiently Islamic, and so on. But so it doesn't simply take over as the Islamic Orthodox position or anything like it. But that's where that tradition goes. And the places where it has its most direct impact is things like the Book of Causes and the Theology of Aristotle text, translated by the Al-Kindi Circle. And the place where it culminates is in Avicenna, who's the sort of systematizer, the Islamic, an Islamic version of a kind of Aquinas figure who brings all that together into an Islamic synthesis. And that's quite late. That's in the 1000. That's 1000 basically. Does that help?
Mhm.
And by the way, some of that comes back both from him and from Averroes into the Latin West. They have translations of the Book of Causes into Latin from the Arabic by that time. And to show you what a good scholar he was, Aquinas figured out that some of the Book of Causes had to be from Porphyry, where for literally 900 years people hadn't noticed this. You have to be deep enough in the doctrines to know that this is actually that, and Aquinas is deep enough in the doctrine to see things like that. Anyway, all of that is just we're just getting started on Philo's positive understanding. What are the negative theology results of this? So she goes on a lot about this. Does Philo wind up with a God who is ineffable? Yes. There's things about this mind of God idea that wind up being important for several of the later theological positions. First of all, it's kind of tried to assimilate the God as being idea, and it's also got has an idea of God as mysterious because there's something free about this mind. There's also something infinite about it. So some of these aspects will be brought out by some of the later theologians without necessarily fully ascribing to the mind of God position, so to speak. Sorry, mind of the universe position. But some of the things that you find in this chapter where Dee is explaining he gets this notion that God is mysterious from this section in Exodus where they're talking about a dark cloud, right? That's not where he's getting it from, right? He's an allegorical interpreter who is seeing this possible reading in it because it's what he thinks anyway. He's thinking of those things anyway because of his positive view, and then he's seeing echoes of it that he can assimilate to that in the text that he can, and then he can point out. So that's why, this is mysterious and so forth. Certainly by the time people like Maimonides, right, there's plenty of, I forget to put it this way, traditional problems here, right? Moses is supposed to be the man who sees God face to face, but the only time when he ever talks about it, he sees a burning bush or his back, right? So there's all these kinds of, put it this way, these chestnuts of difficulty of interpretation in the Old Testament, which you find mulled over by Maimonides, but also mulled over by Philo. But in the case of Philo, he has a positive conception to begin with, right? He's not reading these answers out of a strained reading of a passage in Exodus, right? It's the other way around. He's taking his clear conception of what his concept of God is, and he's deducing from it how he should read this passage in Exodus. The single most important actual biblical text for him in that is the I am that I am passage, and she's correctly pointing this out in numbers of these people, that the I am that I am passage is the place where you get something like a true core meaning of the understanding of God that's present in the Old Testament, right? But the question is, how is it read, right? Because that could be read as just God as being very easily. And instead, what you get from Philo is he reads it more mysteriously than that, right? It's God as a cause of being, but more mysterious than, higher than being, because he's going to make much of the future tense aspect of it, I shall be that I shall be, or something, as being an undetermined or a free. So he's going to take the being idea and add a freedom to it, because to him it's a mind, not a metaphysical principle. So that's what's characteristic about how Philo reads that. All these other people are going to wind up reading that as also, well, not only, almost all these other people are going to wind up reading that passage as also critical to how they understand what the Old Testament's understanding of God is. How negative is it? On its face, it's not that negative. On its face, it's pretty positive. It's a positive answer to a positive question. It can be read as more mysterious, and Philo tries to. That's one of the reasons why she says that there's a negative aspect of his thinking, negative theology aspect of his thinking. He's insisting upon an incomprehensibility of God somehow by not reading this as simply a metaphysical principle of being. And I think that is there, but it's motivated too. It's motivated by a prior understanding of a positive conception of God as mind-like. Okay.
Another question that comes up in the middle of that is the distinction between the nature of God and the limitations of the human intellect on the other side of it.
Yes.
And I see that in kind of a tension, not just who God is that gets emphasized, but what it is that the human intellect is capable of doing.
Yes, and there's controversial things here. On the one hand, it's very easy to make the claim that God is a mind so transcendent that no finite human being in time can possibly understand it, right? And then there's also a little text saying man is made in the image of God because of both minds. So Philo's way out of that is saying, yes, we can't understand God because we can't understand our own minds either, right? But it sort of weakens the case that if the reason why God is incomprehensible is because he's so transcendent, right? That's different from if the reason you can't understand him because he's a mind, because in the latter case, the outcome depends upon you not being able to understand your own mind, right? And
the section at the bottom of 211 into 212 seem to to me to really get into that kind of aspect.
Yeah, we'll get
And,
to the, you're right to point it out. Sorry, go ahead.
And also the top of 211, God is unknowable, not simply in himself, but also because mortal nature does not have the capacity to understand him. That was the part that stuck out in this section. Same sense of what we have with modern people's attempts at understanding this same kind of concept.
Yes, in the previous page, we also had not just that no creature is capable of understanding divine nature. We had particularly that the thing which cannot be understood is God's ousia, right? Ousia. That's being, its substance. We'll hear it again in all of the Christology stuff, right? What can be understood about God? His acts, his deeds, the creation, his footprints, right? So this notion is already there in Philo. We'll see it again repeatedly made much of. Philo also says, as she points out at one point, that all that we can know of God is that he is, not what he is. Now this has to be taken with, a tub full of salt, because you still know that the that which is existing is something which deserves to be called God, or there's no inference from the creation, right? You do not deduce from the creation that a blueberry scone exists, right? So the thatness is not simply a thatness if it's a godness. A godness is already something which is a what and not just a that, right? So Philo does make the extreme claim that the only thing that man can know of God is that he is, not what he is. But the fact that that you're knowing that it is God is already telling you something about a what. From the particular way the deduction was done, it's something like an intelligible creator of the universe, or creator. This matters a ton because in each of these places, you're going to get the combination of each of these people, you're going to get a combination of claims about the limitation of being able to know something, which are themselves deduced from something which is claimed to be known about the nature of the thing you're talking about. In the case of Philo, it's that God is the creator. In the case of Gregory, it will be that God is infinite, right? In the case of the old Parmenides things, it was that the one is one, and therefore simple and not complex. But there's always something where you're doing this dialectical game of making deductions from an abstract principle, and then you're deducing from those deductions all kinds of negative statements that have all kinds of place all kinds of limitations on what can be known about something, right? But all the claims that you know that there are limitations about what you can know about it are based upon these dialectical deductions from something actually known, posited as known, or experienced as known, or something, right? It's not simply, if all that you had was a nothing could be known and that there's only a that would just be that something is. You wouldn't know that something is God, right? So you have to be very careful with these things. These things get very slippery very fast when they're claiming I know nothing, and then they tell you all these things that they can deduce from it. You can't deduce things from knowing absolutely nothing, right? There has to be some principle that they're positing first, from which the other things are deductions. Okay, but this claim that you cannot know the ousia, we will get, as I said, we'll saw that in Philo. We'll see that again in multiple other places. Does Philo the inventor of that distinction? I don't think so. I think it's already there in philosophy before then. Certainly, D has a tendency, when we're talking about Gregory of Nyssa in particular, to describe this distinction between ousia and energeia, between the substance or the being and the energies, and say it's on the basis of making this distinction that Gregory of Nyssa is able to do X or is able to do Y. She kind of doesn't notice that against Eunomius is doing exactly that, making exactly that distinction, and Gregory's arguing against it. So what you can and cannot deduce from the distinction between energies and being is a point of contention in all of this. It's not something where just inventing that distinction makes the problems go away, not even remotely. The other thing I want to point out about Philo is Philo matters in all this for understanding where some of the problems come in with Christology and the Trinity, because he doesn't have those problems, right? He's free to have a transcendently unknowable God who still has to at least appear in the works of creation in order to be able to have the chosen people and all the other kind of stuff that God has to do in the Old Testament, right? He has to have some immanent aspect as well as whatever transcendent aspect. But he doesn't need to square any circles in that. He has a logos doctrine because he's assimilating it to something like providence of the governance of the world. He doesn't need to have a first, second, and third person of the Trinity for any doctrinal reason. And he doesn't have to explain the distinction between them for any doctrinal reason. We also saw this to some degree in Plotinus. Plotinus actually did have a Trinity. We noticed the top of his hierarchy had that same threefold structure, but it was purely for philosophical reasons. There weren't any doctrinal reasons for it. He wasn't committed to it on any doctrinal basis. He didn't have to argue for it and avoid one another understanding of it. He could just follow whatever he thought the metaphysics or his dialectical reasoning had for him. This is true for Philo as well. Okay. There's one other point I want to make here, which is, and she doesn't really harp on this, but beginning of the next chapter, before you get to Gregory, we're going to have brief things about Justin Martyr and Clement and some of the things in the text of the Old Testament itself in between. And you might not notice, but if you read back to Philo, you'll see there's a thread going through them. Each of them is mentioning uncreated as one of the predicates that can be truthfully applied to God. She even calls the subtitles a chapter on Philo, Escape to the Uncreated. We saw that, uncreated as the transcendent in the whole Gnostic religion book, right? The transcendent religion of salvation aspect of the transcendent God aspect that we saw in the whole period is all insisting on this uncreate. And that's there also in Plotinus, right? And the stuff we saw in the Neoplatonism chapter. Okay, why does this matter? Uncreated is going to become ungenerated by the time of Justin Martyr and Clement. And in this book, Gregory's whole problem is that this guy wants to claim that ungenerated is a proper concept that you can use to deduce the characteristics of God the Father. Why? Why does that matter? Because this guy doesn't think you can call the only begotten Son of God ungenerated. Because to him, unbegotten and ungenerated are synonyms. So the distinction between created, eternal or not, generated or not, and the whole incarnation question are going to get all snarled up. And before there's anything like this controversy or the Arian controversy, all the Christian fathers are saying ungenerate is the name of God, right? They're not seeing a problem there. And in that, they're at one with the Platonists and with Philo, right? By the time that the Arian controversy is hot in his mind, and this guy comes along and says, of course, we just call, we can deduce the characteristics of God, not from the notion of being or the notion of infinite, but from the notion of ungenerated, right? It didn't need to be generated. Gregory is going to say that's going to lead you straight to Arianism. You cannot say that you know that God is ungenerated, or you're going to make a distinction between the Father and the Son, and you're going to divide their substance, right? And at the end of all that, you're going to think that only the God the Father deserves to be called God, right? So that is the burning issue when Gregory is arguing against Eunomius, and it's the burning issue with the pseudo-Arians, and it's the burning issue with the same substance or similar substance, which is the one extra I in the homo-ousi or the homo-iousun, I can't pronounce these names. The one extra iota, right? Is all about this. But what are those iotas about? They're about substance, right? It's sameness of substance in the three persons of the Trinity that is a doctrinal controversy they're all arguing about. But we just saw Philo say you can never know the ousia Gregory will agree you can never know the ousia. You can know only external things, but it doesn't extend to the capacity of the mind to know the true essence being of God. So you have this curious situation where Gregory is saying the problem with Eunomius is he thinks he can understand the substance of God. We have to understand that the substances of the three persons of the Trinity are exactly the same and not similar. So this is going to issue in the statement that the nature of the Trinity is incomprehensible. And if you get it wrong by a single iota, you're a heretic. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I had a question. When I was in high school, 60 years ago, one of my instructors, history instructor, thought it was very amusing how much controversy existed over the filioque
Yes.
addition of language that came out of one of the councils, as opposed to, I suppose, the normal pater et filius.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that relate precisely? Because it related to the homoousis versus homo. Well,
I know the extra iota better than the oque, but maybe Chuck can fill us in on the filioque as opposed to filius.
Actually, I
Maybe
had
you
an
don't know.
impression about filioque, and it's just been recently overthrown by a different reference I
Okay.
found in Wikipedia. So I would like to stay silent on the matter because I think
There you
I
go.
need to do more research.
There you go. Yes, if you don't know of that of which we do not know, thereof we must remain silent, right? Say many of these people.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, you can see why this is a live issue. I mean, when Gregory is arguing against Eunomius, right? He'll say, if I accept your version of the distinction between the first and second person of the Trinity, I'm going to be led to outright Judaism, right? So this, to a modern ear, is maybe a less damning thing than it sounded to him. But the Philo's understanding, maybe, it's hard to say, maybe Plotinus' understanding, certainly Muhammad's understanding, are all going to be on the side of of Eunomius in this regard. On this point, they're simply Arians, right? And they think that if you're going to have any person of the Trinity that in any sense can be called begotten, then it's not going to be the same transcendent, unbegotten, uncreated that everybody else was talking about in their metaphysics.
I thought one of the Kant phrases was the only begotten Son of God.
It absolutely is. That's the whole point. The whole point is you have to believe simultaneously that you have an only begotten Son who nevertheless is of exactly the same substance as God the Father, who is ungenerate and exists from eternity.
This is meiosis versus mitosis, I guess.
Well, it's a question of what one substance means. When Gregory wants to illustrate what it means to have one substance, he names Peter, Paul, and Mary are all human beings, so they have one substance, but they're three persons, right? In other words, he doesn't think that having the same substance means being the same entity. He thinks it means having the same nature. In this case, the godly nature, right? But Eunomius thinks that God the Father is older than God the Son, not necessarily older in time, but older in the sense that among the works of God the Father is to generate the Son, and is not among the works of the Son to generate the Father, right? So in that sense, there's a containing power in the Father, which is greater than that in the Son. Therefore, they differ in their energies and their acts. And from their energies and their acts, we know the difference in their natures, will Eunomius claim. And this is going to drive Gregory right up the wall. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
It seems to me that the confusion is in some ways is almost just linguistic, isn't it? Because if they had some different label than Father, Son, to describe the relationship between the two divine ousias, you wouldn't have this sense of one coming before the other. Because after all, in Genesis, doesn't say, and the word was with God, logos, and then of course it comes back
Nope,
and
doesn't say that in Genesis. It only says that in the Gospel according to John at the beginning of it.
well, that shows how much I don't know about the Bible.
Right.
But anyway,
But the point is that that's a work which is not accepted by the Jews, it's only accepted by the Christians. Right?
Right.
The whole point is, because the Old Testament, predates Christianity completely, you have to read it very allegorically to see allusions to anything like Jesus or Christ or a logos in any eternal sense already existing there, right? The incarnation is a mystery, but it's supposed to be a mystery of something that it deserves to be called God appearing in time in the human body, right? And this is something which Christianity stands or falls on, right? And so you have to ask how they understand it. Gregory, that is Gregory the Great, not Gregory, Basil the Great, Gregory's teacher, right, had a version of an understanding of that everyone seemed to accept, right? This is the three persons in one substance formula that he understood in a basically Platonic way, if I can put it that way. And that is kind of what became the Orthodox position, certainly in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Gregory is squarely behind it. But it does mean that some of the previous use of ungenerate as not just a name of God, but a name of God that conveys dialectical information from which you can deduce things, the same as one used to, or simple used to, or being used to, right? Gregory of Nyssa is going to argue against that, and he's going to claim that Eunomius is arrogant to think that his understanding of ungenerate is true thought about God, right? God is too mysterious for his feeble deductions about what the word ungenerate means to reveal to him the mysteries of the Trinity, right? That's basically going to be Gregory's position. But the reason he's worried about it is what's at stake is Christianity going to hold up as something fundamentally distinct from Judaism or Islam? One. And two, if so, does it have a coherent metaphysics at its head or not? Because most of the coherent metaphysics about God that were running around in the ancient world before then were, if I can put it this way, designed for one God, not for a Trinity. This is one of the reasons that I think, this is one of the reasons that I think that the Neoplatonists matter more than you might think, because there was a notion of God that was running around that did have a Trinity natural to it. Go ahead, Joe.
can you explain how Saint Ignatius fits into that?
I don't know him as well.
I do like the way that you've included Islam into that, in the sense that that one of their major sticking points was the Trinity, was the
Yes.
at least the divineness of Jesus, and the demotion back to a prophet
Yes.
that basically replaced there, and so it brings out that there must have been a chain of thinking that was following along with this kind of stuff we're talking about here.
Yes, right. The desire to make Jesus just a prophet is as a.
I wanted to log in.
Sorry, I got some echo from you, Joe.
Remember, this is Jason's show, and so he's the presenter.
Sorry,
and the rest of it.
Joe, can you go on mute if you're not talking? We're getting echo from you in the room.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say how to put it. To me, it is interesting that a Platonic metaphysics gave the Eastern Orthodox position a version of Trinity doctrine that they could sort of rationally ground, which wasn't there for anyone else. What I mean by anyone else, outside of that tradition, it didn't make sense, right? You find places in Augustine where he says, it's almost incomprehensible how any mind in time could understand the Trinity, right? And he says something, this is one of the more engaging things about Augustine. We're not the Augustine chapter yet, but one of the engaging things about Augustine is when he doesn't understand something, he doesn't tell you that this thing cannot be understood like all these other people do. He just tells you, I didn't understand it, right? He has a disarming humility about his honest confession of inability, right? And that's what he does here. He says, I've written you this entire book about the Trinity, but I don't understand it. My mind did not attain to a full understanding of it. I can't claim that I understand it. I don't know if it can't be understood, but I know that I didn't, right? So that's the kind of, if I can put it this way, humility take you get in the Latin West, right? As opposed to Gregory has a kind of humility for export. That Eunomius cannot be correct in his understanding of the Trinity because it results in conclusions which lead to Arianism. So it must be so incomprehensible that you cannot use deductions from terms like ungenerate to understand the nature of God. What does Gregory substitute instead? Gregory's notion, he does have a core notion that he's deducing all these other characteristics of God from, but it's infinite, non-finite, not having outline, not having shape, whatever. And that gets him directly to an incomprehensibility that will deny Eunomius his starting point, right? He will claim that Eunomius cannot know that ungenerate does apply to the Father and doesn't apply to the Son, because he's trying to reason as though he had a finite essence to reason with about something which is infinite. Whereas he should just confess that he does not understand it. So as a rhetorical counterattack, this makes some sense, but as a defense of the statement that you have to believe that the exact relationship among the persons of the Trinity is that they are three persons with one substance, right? And that solves all problems, right? It sits less well with that. What do I mean by that? That claims that it is possible to have positive knowledge of those things. You can have a correct understanding of the Trinity. Therefore, you can be blamed if you have an incorrect understanding of it. But Gregory is in the position of saying there is only one correct understanding of the Trinity, and the Trinity is incomprehensible at the same time, right? If Gregory had deduced from the fact that the Trinity is incomprehensible, both that this is how he understands the Trinity, but he cannot claim that it is entirely right, he would be on sounder ground. But that wasn't enough for him because he's worried about an Arian heresy dividing the church, right? It's too live an issue for him to simply say, because it's hard to understand, let everyone try to understand it in his own way and no one actually will, right? That sort of pacifistic, let 1,000 flowers bloom version of how you deal with incomprehensibility was not open to Gregory, because it wasn't just a matter of a few people will think one thing. It was like the semi-Arians were going to depose all the anti-Arians from all their bishoprics, right? Anyway, so I just trying to bring out how all of these philosophical doctrinal things were live issues, and issues in which, in some cases, the maneuvering room is dwindling to a point, right? When we were back in the Neoplatonists, it felt like anything you could come up with that seemed plausible, right, you might be able to arrive at. When we read the Gnostics, we saw this wild profusion of crazy doctrines of visions and reading off from images of how things might work in the heavens, and turning those into positive statements. Here instead, we have cases where the propositions that people are trying to simultaneously maintain are, forcing them to narrower and narrower positions where only one thing can thread the needle, and it's not clear if anything can thread the needle. Reactions to any of that?
I guess I will say one thing about the filioque clause that Joe brought up. I did ask a member here at St. Mary's who is conversant with Greek, how in Greek Orthodoxy, the origin of the Holy Spirit is considered to be. And his comment was that the Greek that is used in the Nicene Creed is that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. And proceeds, he said, as a Greek word, means marches forth.
Mm-hmm.
So doesn't say it was begotten, doesn't say it was at the beginning, but it says
Yep.
the Holy Spirit marches forth from the Father. And at that point in time, the Creed did not say, and the Son.
Yep.
The addition and the Son comes from other passages in Scripture in the New Testament where Jesus says, I will send you my Spirit. Well, in what sense is it my Spirit if it's not also something that is unique
From
to
him,
him,
yes.
from him?
Yes. So this makes perfect sense to me now. I mean, because in the Eunomius stuff, right? Eunomius has a position where he wants to say that the Father begets the Son, and then that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Son, not directly from the Father, right?
Oh,
So
really?
there's a chain of containment between them, of A causes B causes C in the sense of a proceeding. And for Eunomius, this is a something like a Neoplatonic tower of emanations, right? From the highest or most central Godhead to the lower ones, and the Holy Spirit in that sense is something like the even the governing of the world. The creation of the world is at the level of the Logos. So there are different works being ascribed to each of these as well, which is in some ways assimilating it to versions of, that is the Trinity doctrine, to versions of Neoplatonism, and maybe even has some correspondence with some versions of Gnosticism. But the point is that in all of that, there is a distinguishing of the levels with a prior and a later, not necessarily in a temporal sense, but in a what is metaphysically founded on what else, or what subsists in what else. And the part of it which is bothering Gregory the most in the against Eunomius is the fact that the Son proceeding from the, or only begotten of the Father, is heading towards Arianism. He's worried. But in Eunomius, the relation of the Spirit is also directly to the Son and not directly to the Father. So I would guess that the first clause, that saying the Holy Spirit is proceeding from the Father, was put in first to avoid such tower chaining, right? And then the and from the Son was put in to make it three-way instead of only both of them proceeding from the Father, because then that could again seem to ascribe a certain priority to the Father, right? You're completing the third side of the triangle with the filioque, right? Instead of just having both coming from the Father. But all of this is trying to avoid distinctions in the Trinity that make them an ordered set, right? Whether it's an ordered set because only God is at the only Father is at the apex, or because it's a chain of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but trying to leave them as equalized as possible. And some of that equalization of them goes back to Basil, I think, in terms of his understanding of it. Anyway, I think that it is possible to have a consistent Platonic understanding of the Trinity, or even a consistent Platonian understanding of the Trinity, but they're not going to sit very well with the notion that the Trinity is unknowable. And what we find in Gregory is, under the pressure of controversy, he's going to insist both that there's only one correct interpretation of the Trinity, and that the doctrine of the Trinity is incomprehensible to the human mind.
I have a question going back to Philo.
Yes.
In the many centuries after Philo, within the Jewish tradition, no one among the rabbis would ever refer back to Philo.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And so did they just so strenuously object to his adherence to Platonic ideals and ideas that he was almost no longer considered to be Jewish?
No, I don't think it's that. I mean, he was thought of as being quite Greek, but the other thing that bothered a lot of the rabbinic scholars in the say from the period of the Talmud to the time of before Maimonides was that his allegorical interpretations often get very loose. I think Dee has a comment someplace that Philo's mind is like a butterfly, right? He's
Yes.
flitting from one association to the next. He's a very loosey-goosey thinker, and he's always going to find the harmony in things, never the distinction between things. And I think that was off-putting to a legalistic mind, right? So the legalistic side of reading Torah as almost legal interpretation was put off by that manner, at least as much as it was by the Greek philosophy aspect. Now that does change in Judaism with Maimonides. Maimonides is much friendlier to Philo than the earlier Jewish tradition, incorporates some of him, leaves a bunch of him behind, and basically after Maimonides, Philo is taken much more charitably, if I can put it that way, with the having passed through the gate of what Moses Maimonides accepts of him is acceptable, and what Moses Maimonides rejected of him is, too flighty. But not rejected as being too Greek at that point, but just as being too flighty. But so
in that sense,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, in that sense, since Maimonides, would Philo be studying in a Reformed seminary, Reformed Jewish seminary?
Quite possibly. The two early writers before the Talmud that are usually read there, and besides Maimonides, would be Philo and Josephus. Josephus for history, and especially for understanding the time of the origin of Christianity from a Jewish point of view. Josephus is considered, basically a Roman Jew, but he's still sympathetic enough that he's taken seriously. So the typical people would typically read Josephus, Philo, Maimonides outside of just the Torah and rabbinical literature. Some might leave Philo out of that. Some might leave Philo out of that, though. I mean, they still read Josephus. He's more acceptable because he's talking about the history more than anything else, rather than the theology.
And then, of course, you get further pruning when you get to both conservative and Orthodox traditions.
Yeah, I don't know the conservatives wouldn't read those. But I don't know enough about the Orthodox or ultra Orthodox. It's a fair question. Not expert on it, but I do know that plenty of my Jewish friends read Josephus and want to make sure that other people have heard the history from Josephus and not just from non-Jewish sources. You can put it that way. Okay. We've talked about, to me, the main things in Gregory of Nyssa, but I want to talk about his actual positive understanding for a second, because his positive understanding is not the mind of God one you get in Philo, and it's not simply the being one that you get as an interpretation of the I am passage of Exodus either. It's Gregory has this, he's going to dialectically reason from the notion of God as infinite, right? That's the key thing that is leading him to his deductions of incomprehensibility or his deductions of ineffability. He's not starting from some Parmenidean notion that God is simple. He's not starting from a notion that God is being. He's certainly not starting from any notion that God is the idea of the good, right? He's starting from the notion that God is infinite. Infinite and uncreated. He even will at times assimilate eternity and infinity. The human mind cannot understand this thing because it is eternal. You cannot understand this thing because it is infinite. the critical passage here is the crag analogy on 252 to 253. This is what I think the soul experiences when it goes beyond its footing of material things in its quest for that which has no dimensions and which exists from all eternity. For here there is nothing it can take hold of, neither place nor time, neither measure nor anything else. It does not allow our minds to approach. And thus the soul, slipping at every point from which cannot be grasped, becomes dizzy and perplexed and returns once again to what is natural to it. Content now to know merely this about the transcendent, that it is completely different from the nature of the things that the soul knows. So the critical thing is infinite as formless as without boundary, giving nothing for the mind to grasp, incomprehensible on that basis. But this is practically equated to anything which exists from all eternity. And you see this repeatedly in Gregory, that he will say, how can you claim to know this thing about some transcendent fact when you cannot even know your own mind, or you cannot even know a small ant which you can see, right? He has a hierarchy in which the perceptibles are more, and the finite are more comprehensible. And it's important to notice that this is a switching of the signs of comprehensibility between the perceptibles and the intelligibles compared to Plato. Plato called the intelligibles, not because they were unintelligible, but because they were intelligible. He was thinking of things like math, right? For Plato, you think in terms of ideas, you think with ideas, but for the material things, your ideas and those material things don't actually perfectly coincide. The material thing is always only a slippery approximation to your ideas, and it squirts out from under them. It is always changing. So you cannot fully comprehend changeable things to Plato. But if the thing is ideal, then it can perfectly coincide with your understanding of it, and your reasonings about it can be certain. And he was thinking especially things like math, and that was the reason why he thought that the realm of the intelligibles deserved to be called the realm of the intelligibles. They were more intelligible because they were more rational, because things just coincided exactly with their definitions. Okay. But Gregory is telling you, if your senses have no access to something, then you cannot comprehend it. He thinks that the intelligible, not the intelligible, he thinks what you can understand and the sensible are going to much more closely coincide. He even goes on to say, you never know the ousia of something, you only know its works, right? In a way which is reminiscent of Kant. It's the thing in itself that's unknowable because you only have its phenomena. And your access to the phenomena is through your senses. So he's like a Kantian empiricist before the letter. He's not a Platonist in his epistemology at all, right? He has aspects of some of his doctrines might seem Platonist, but he's not a Platonist in his epistemology at all. He doesn't think that the fact that something is abstract and ideal means it's intelligible. If something is completely inaccessible by the senses and outside of time, he thinks your mind has nothing to hold on to with it. Now, to be fair, he's saying this of the formless of the infinite specifically, but he never brings up an example from math. You will never find Gregory talking about how this thing is completely comprehensible because it's just math. He will instead say, this thing is more comprehensible than your mind because at least you can see the ant, but you can't understand the ant because it's too complicated for you to understand, right? And too small for your senses to have easy access to it. But those things are far more comprehensible to you than anything that you have no access to from your senses. Yes. So there's a bunch of this stuff in the area from like 236 to 241. The point is, some of Gregory's epistemological faint-heartedness about the knowability of God is just an unknowability of all essences in themselves, and an unknowable of anything that you do not have sensory access to. And in these respects, he's a Kantian. I mean, way before the time, right? He's saying something like, if your understanding does not have an actual object to hold on to, its reasonings are unsound, in a way which is very anticipatory of Kant. So you then have to ask, what is this ousia business, right? This ousia business is the thing you cannot know about anything because you only know its exterior actions. And it's a thing in itself. It's a Kantian thing in itself that's unknowable, and not just about God, right? So ousias in general have this incomprehensibility about them. Now, that's the kind of thing that a Platonist would might acknowledge for your attempts to apply your concepts to material things, with which might not coincide. But if you're talking about abstract things, ideal things, sees no reason why your ideals and the things cannot coincide exactly. You can know the ousia of a triangle to a Platonist, right? It's in a definition, right? But you don't get that in Gregory. In Gregory, the model of knowledge is much closer to an empirical model of knowledge, and then the very abstract things are less comprehensible. And if something is both abstract and infinite, it is infinitely incomprehensible. There's even a passage in the Against Humanus where he says, you know, something like he's trying to reason about infinities and the different persons, and he says, can anyone tell me, you know, any rational way for some mind to distinguish one infinity from another? And you know, you're reading this, you know, now, and you're like, you know, George Cantor, please pick up the white courtesy phone, right? Right, but here he's trying to say something like, you cannot have a Father greater than the Son, greater than the Holy Spirit, if they're all infinite, because anything which is infinite is equal to anything else which is infinite, right? There are no orders of infinity in Gregory. And on its face, with what they knew at his time about infinity, or maybe of infinity in a strict enough sense, as opposed to some you know, too delimited notion of infinity, it makes a certain sense. But I'm bringing out that that's the kind of thinking you get in Gregory, right? It's this. It's also why his metaphors and examples tend to be down to earth, right? You have to imagine that you have someone who is at bottom a very earthy and skeptical empiricist type of thinker with a Kantian epistemology, is the person trying to puzzle out theories of the Trinity, right? And so of course he's going to find a lot of incomprehensibility in it. But at least for his immediate rhetorical needs, that's convenient, because he doesn't want someone like a Eunomius finding inconvenient logical deductions from some concept that has to be applied to this or that person of the Trinity. Okay. The one other thing I noticed, both in the Philo chapter and in this chapter, I hear them going through this whole formula of lists of the nature of the ineffability of God, and one of them keeps coming up as, and without a contrary. This is one of those very slippery concepts you can just easily see go flying by and not pay any attention to. What does it mean to say that God is without a contrary? It's a very confused notion. What they're trying to get at is something like, you cannot deduce everything that it is from one single thing that it is not, right? Because it's not simply a hot-cold distinction where you can understand cold as the absence of heat, something like that. But stated boldly, on its face, it's claiming this thing doesn't have a contrary. And every piece of the reasoning falls apart if you take that literally. You're trying to say this thing is incomprehensible because it has no contrary. Well, here's this other thing I can comprehend. Is it contrary to it or not? Is God not a blueberry scone? If God is not a blueberry scone, then God is a contrary, right? So it's proving way too much. I think as a merely verbal formula, it's like tacked on there at the end to say, and any of the other things you might try to do, right? But it's not a well-formed thought, unless you read having a contrary as this sort of narrow dichotomy sense of cold is the absence of heat, as though it's only one axis of distinction.
Can I,
Sure.
as I was reading that part in Gregory, I had an echo of something else that I think is a useful distinction. And I picked that up from Hayek, who was talking about, for example, some of the concepts that we use all the time or like to be aware of all the time, such as justice. You can't take a positive approach to describe what might be justice, but you can recognize injustice every time you do see it, because you feel it among other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the same logic or approach could be applied to truth. We might fish around a long time to figure out what truth is, but we can definitely find out what falsehood is. It's more concrete. It's more, it just jumps out at you when you finally notice that it's false. And that sounds almost like Karl Popper, indirectly, who was a close friend of Hayek also.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious about this thing with God. Struck me as being very analogous there, because if you can't say anything positive about God, you can definitely say he's not a blueberry stone.
One hopes.
So,
but the point is that one of the positive things that they're trying, well, one of the negative things they're trying to say about God is that you cannot understand it by a contrary, but that thought that X has no contrary is on its own face an incoherent thought. It's not an X unless it has a contrary. But related to this is, this is the part of this, the formula of the, you can know that, but you cannot know what, right? There's a version of this that can make sense. You can fix this notion up so that it makes sense. You can say, when we're trying to say that you can know the that, but not the what, you're trying to say you cannot exhaustively know the what. You cannot know the whole what, right? But if you think that you can know the that, but not the what, without some qualification of the what as exhaustive, this doesn't make any sense. You cannot know a there exists question about a particular thing without knowing some version of a what that delimits that thing as the thing that you're talking about, whose existence you are assessing, right? So if God's footprints are supposed to be detectable in the creation, you have to make sure that you can distinguish the footprints of God in creation from the footprints of blueberry scones in creation, which presumably are very small. But the point is, you can't know the that without some delimiting of the what. The what that you're trying to limit there is something like some sign of intelligence or order, or architectural thought or something like that. And that's the that you're trying to assess. But that is not just a that. It's a that with a secret what, right? A perhaps formal what, perhaps not fully exhaustive what, but there's some what there where you cannot determine if you're even asking the that question about the same that. What I see in cases like this is there's a purely verbal formula that has been found to try to express some degree of incomprehensibility, and the people using it are not thinking it through in terms of its logical implications. Its logical implications are too big. They'd be saying too much if you tried to take them literally, right? So the only charitable reading is that they're not being exact enough, and that what they really mean by saying you can't know it as you can't know the what is you can't know all of the what. And if you look at how they're actually arriving at this, you'll find that there is some prior notion, creator, good, being, one, that is informing the that question, that is the what that the that question is actually about, infinite, without trying to know the rest of the what. The problem is it's selective, right? Which one of those that's do you start from, and how much have you smuggled in by that original understanding? Because Gregory's fundamental problem with eunomius is he's starting from the wrong version of that what when he's starting from ungenerated, right? He doesn't like the conclusions that come if you start from ungenerated instead of from infinite, right? Okay. Right. Do we want to talk a little bit about the Augustine chapter? I know 2 of you didn't read it, but some of you expressed some interest in what we might say about it. We can return to it next time as well. We can at least quickly talk about the Augustine thing. I think the contrast is useful in the same session. The basic story, is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay. I think the basic story about the Augustine thing, again, we got to put out the positive version first, right? And she practically gives you, she honestly only gives you half of it, but she does give you half of the positive version when she quotes him describing thinking about the good. Where is this? Yes, page 268. This is just the inset quote on page 268. If it were possible to put aside those goods which are good by participation in the good, and to see the good itself, in which they are good by participation, for when you hear of this or that good, you also understand the good itself at the same time. If therefore, I repeat, you could put these goods aside and perceive the good in itself, you would see God. Okay. She's reading that as an incredibly negative passage and a matter of abstraction, but there's nothing abstract about it. This is just straight Platonism. This is just the idea of the good as defined in Platonism. So she's just saying there, if you could see the good in itself, you would see God. That's as direct a positive statement of what Augustine means by God as you could want. Now, the curious thing about Augustine, though, and I think she's right about this in the rest of the chapter, is that his fundamental notion of God isn't simply that one. It's also the being notion of God. She calls it the transcend. She calls it the source of all being that is transcendent over all being, but it's not transcendent over all being. It's just plain being. Augustine's notion of God is this. It's an equality sign. It's the being notion taken from the from Exodus as just the idea of being, or being itself, not the being of a particular being, but being itself, and Plato's idea of the good, because he just told you that. He's got an equal sign between the two things. That's the characteristic positive understanding of what is meant by the term God that you get in Augustine. Being itself and the idea of the good. Why would being itself and the idea of the good be the same thing? It doesn't tell you, except that being is good, right? The most characteristic doctrine on other topics of Augustine is the idea that evil has no positive existence, but is the mere absence of good, right? So it is an absence of being, right? It is just absence. And he doesn't understand absence as a positive thing at all. So I put it to you that this equation of the being idea of Exodus with the good idea of the good in Plato, putting an equal sign between them and deducing from that evil has no positive existence, that's Augustine. That's Augustine's position in the spectrum of theologies and approaches to the problem of evil at the same time. And they're coming from this equal sign between a Platonic conception and a Old Testament conception of God. There are other things in Augustine which are also specific to him that I think to some degree follow from that. You know, the way of love that she goes on about which we can go back to. But all of those things slot into this positive conception. Now we need to contrast this to Plato himself, because in Plato himself, we saw in the Republic, has his notion of the idea of the good is beyond being. It's not being equated with being, right? He doesn't have, in Plato himself, you don't see this, I am that I am version of God you get in the Old Testament. You get a hierarchy between good and being, where good is above being. And we saw that again in Plotinus, where one and good may be equated with each other. We're above being and nous, being and mind. In Philo, we saw mind and being together on the same level as God. Here we're seeing good and being on the same level as God, right? So the same terms are being found in this triangle, but sometimes they're moving, sometimes there's just two of them, sometimes there's equal signs between them, right? And each one has a characteristically different feel and take to the whole rest of the theology that can be deduced from it. But in that little typology, the position that Augustine is in is he is equating the idea of the good with the idea of being and calling both of them God. Okay. Thoughts or questions on that before we get to the later parts of it? I realize some of you haven't done the reading, so it's hard, but you just react to the things I'm saying if they make sense to you or not.
Well, I like to see how you spelled out differences, important differences between, Augustine's equation and
Plato and Philo and
Plato,
so on. Yeah.
Philo, because that clarifies, because I've often wondered about how one should interpret these diagrams and the hierarchy things when one maybe jumps out from the Neoplatonic context and maybe go up to Kant level or something.
Well, so it's interesting. When we were reading the Heidegger a while ago, there was a place where we came across Heidegger reacting to the idea of the good in Plato. And we noticed that he said, so here, he's talking about this notion of the good that is beyond being. And within one page, Heidegger was back to calling that being. He called the good that was beyond being, oh, it's beyond the being of the beings, of course, but that's just what we mean by being. So he put an equal sign between Plato's good and his being, and he put that equal sign there while commenting on the very passage where Plato was saying that his good was beyond being. Because beyond being for Heidegger does not compute, right? It's his highest concept, so you can't put something higher than it. And instead, he reads someone saying something is higher than being as saying, oh, you're just saying it's higher than the being of these beings out here. But that's what I mean by being. But what's interesting is that means that Heidegger is winding up in the same equal sign as Augustine. Perhaps for a very different reason. In the case of Augustine, it's because he sees something assimilatable about the Platonic idea of the good notion of God and the accompanying idealism, and the God of the Old Testament, especially with a New Testament interpretation put upon him, so to speak. Because the God of the Old Testament without the New Testament put on him might not be so easily equated with the idea of the good. But that's sort of Augustine's reason for seeing the equation between them. Heidegger's is instead that he cannot see anything higher than being. So whatever anyone puts at the top of his hierarchy, he puts equal signs between that and being for him. So, but again, to understand these people's ability to talk to each other and to be talking about the same things, you sort of have to see where they're putting each of these major tokens. The hard part is then to actually be able to read off from any of those, arrangements, what the consequences are, because they do have consequences. They have massive consequences. Yeah. Well, we noticed in the case of Gregory, because he put infinite at the top, we could read off an incomprehensibility, right? We could read off an incomprehensibility as solid as Kant's inability to know the thing in itself. But okay.
I'm thinking back to all the reading I did on Paul Tillich and the God beyond God. And what he was really trying to do is say, you guys haven't thought about the current popular term of God enough and haven't really looked at it again. And he was more trying to wake people up than he was trying to really establish something in that regard.
I think that's right. I think I would also say what is at stake in these questions is far more often the content of the concept to be put there than the claims to be made about the concept, right? It's not, you notice, I noticed this particularly if you're reading Descartes, right? And Descartes is going to give you a proof of the existence of God as he understands it, right? And you have to be very careful to realize that what is happening is that Descartes is telling you what he would call God, right? He's not making some proof claim about the notion of God you happen to come into the room with, right? Which he may not be talking about at all, right? He's talking about his conception of God, and his proof about it is going to tell you what would count as God for him, right? So I think Tillich's thinking is trying to point out that kind of depth in the tradition to people who too easily just assume that the notion of God the average man in the street they run into tomorrow must be the only notion of God that there is. And they don't realize how incoherent a standard is because they're going to get 20, not 1, if they try that experiment, right? And many of those 20 are not even going to be terribly deep, right? So as a call to understand the intellectual depth of your own tradition, I'm entirely behind it, if I can put it that way. But I don't think it necessarily has the kind of irenic consequences that a Paul Tillich might hope for from it. He assumes when everyone examines that, they're all going to agree. But I think that they will have more rationally informed disagreements.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Given the fact that nobody reads them anymore, that's pretty much the case.
most he can hope for, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So all good stuff. I mean, we're a little short. Perhaps we're short on people, and also because we're deciding we're going to do Augustine again next time. I mean, short in time terms. But I want to just throw the door open. I've covered most of the stuff I wanted to cover. I want to throw the floor open to people asking questions about any of the reactions to anything that came up in the discussion. Chuck, you want to start us off? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sam, you had a question?
Yeah, I hope you guys won't consider this as something completely out of left field, but I'm just curious if anybody thinks Heidegger had any possible connection, maybe even purely a rhetorical connection with religious idioms and rhetorics and things like that. Just curious.
I would say absolutely, both in terms of him talking about the notion of ontotheology, right, which is one of his own, themes and terms in much of this, which is in some ways more about seeing a religious aspect to the history of philosophical thought about being, right? That's sort of in Heidegger's own sort of take on the history. That's clearly there. He clearly sees these being questions as having been theological questions as well. He does think to some degree that distorted some of the purely philosophical questions, that they were understood in that theological lens. I think he also thinks that man's role in that conversation was downplayed because it was reified and put off on God, so to speak. So that's just the ontotheology idea in Heidegger. It's also clear to me that there's something like a notion of a piety of thought in Heidegger, in the sense of some kind of duty on the thinking person to attend to the claims of being, or something like this, which is a kind of intellectual piety that's his own internal standard. And then there's also just this fact we were just talking about, that when he's doing things like talking about Plato's idea of the good, he will, on a page where he's interpreting Plato claiming that the good is beyond being, within 3 paragraphs, arrive at the conclusion that therefore Plato is talking about being, because he cannot think something higher than being. Being is his highest concept. So whatever anyone puts in the highest position in their metaphysical hierarchy, Heidegger is going to substitute a triple equal sign to being for it. So those are all ways in which I think Heidegger can be brought into this kind of problematic conversation. I think all those things are true of him. Both that he has this take on the history, where he sees the fact that some of these metaphysical questions were thought of in theological terms as having distorted that history in certain ways, but also ways in which he himself has some of these religious aspects to his own thought, both in terms of the privileging of the position of being for him, and also in terms of his sort of internal ethics of thought in the matter. Is that, before we get to Joe's question, Sam, did that help?
Yeah. By the way, if anybody's interested, the Austin Philosophy Discussion Group will be starting a reading of his,
Which one?
Being and Time.
Okay, yep. We did that
So,
2 years ago, but good to know. Joe, question.
Okay, now back to why Heidegger had the point of view that he holds. Is that because he's a 20th century person and that's post-Kant, and so the idea of the earlier idea where Plato had things above being.
I think it's much more specific to Heidegger. I mean, plenty of people in the 20th century, would not remotely have that point of view. He is a thinker about being. Being is problematic. He thinks that the overlooked problems in the history of thought about being are like a touchstone for understanding Western history, or something like that. That is his own particular thesis. Are there other people in the 20th century who are caring about being? Yes. People like Gilson, but he's thinking of it primarily as a historical question. People like Sartre, but he's influenced by Heidegger directly, right? Heidegger is the reason that sort of existentialist thing becomes a being problematic, so to speak. But existentialism is thinking about being. Existentialism uses formulas about human being that any of the people that we're reading right now would have recognized as statements about God. Right? That the Dasein has an existence, not an essence. That's exactly the same thing that Gregory was just saying about his understanding of God. Right? The that without the what. Why? Because it's free. We saw that in Philo. Right. So many of the things which the existentialists are just saying about human being, you find these classical theologians saying about God. And Hegelian would tell you that's because man has replaced God since Hegel as the focus of concerned human thought, or something like that. And people think that they're thinking about human nature now, or the nature of human existence, where previously they were thinking about theology. And Nietzsche will tell you that's what the old theologians were doing too. They just weren't conscious that that's what they were doing. They were projecting all their standards into theology when they were actually just talking about their standards for man. Right. So all of those are ways in which these things be connected to each other. In terms of their own self-understanding, though, these guys, when they're talking about the relationship between good and being, think that they're talking about fundamental metaphysical bones of the world kinds of questions, and they don't think they're talking just about human society. And they don't think that whatever they put first has to be triple equal to being. If they wanted to put being in the top position of the hierarchy, they would, like Augustine does, right? Whatever equal sign he puts next to it. But if they didn't put it there, like Plotinus doesn't, right? It's not because they agree with Heidegger, but have to substitute terms. It's because they don't agree with Heidegger, right? Excellent question.
Actually, for moving forward, one of the areas that I really wanted to get into, I think we can put it off till next time when everybody's read it, but page 274. That's the one I flagged with having so much stuff in it that I really wanted to dissect it.
You're talking about the way of love?
No, 274 is sort of the middle of that.
Okay.
But it's where she's making the case for negative theology in his thought, and pulls out Romans 1:20 and so I'd like
Yes,
to,
I got you, but I mean, I have to tell you, I mean, of the different Paul texts that she cited, I think fairly for Augustine, Romans 1:20 is the least supportive of her case.
Okay, well, that was the conclusion I came to reading through that page, and I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't too far off base, because
You're not too far off base. I mean, Romans 1:20 is, and especially what comes just before Romans 1:20, right, is extremely positive, right? It's all about how because you can see God visible in the works of creations, you have no excuse for not worshiping God as God, right? And that's the farthest thing from a negative theology of you could not possibly understand God. This is saying there's something about God which is so patently obvious that even those who have never heard the law are responsible for ignoring it if they ignore it. That's how I read Romans.
Okay, so we're pretty much in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, there may be some things after that, in the later parts of that letter that soften that a bit, or talk about start bringing in forgiveness or something. But the early part of that is saying that the existence of God is visible in creation, plain as a pikestaff, and if you don't see it, it's because you're impious. That's how I read Romans 1:20. Yes.
Okay.
That's the problem you have with her interpretation too.
Yeah, and that's the same problem I was having. I was just sitting there going, where did she pull this out from? So
yes.
Okay, good.
Fair. Jack.
I'm going to take advantage of your of the wisdom of you and Craig with regard to this question. Logos is introduced in the chapter on Philo, as I recall.
Yes.
But only briefly. And it occurs to me, the term, I think, from what I had read earlier, first comes into use in Greek in a philosophical manner with Heraclitus.
Correct.
Meaning in its basic understanding, a word, an account, nothing necessarily very earth-shaking or universe-molding. But at least by the time of Philo, through whatever peregrinations Logos has taken, to whatever extent it did in Platonism, how has it come to be what it eventually gets to be in the fourth Gospel of John?
Right. Fair question. So in Heraclitus, it already has a little bit more than just meaning speech or reason. It already means something like the order or structure of things. The most famous of these sayings in Heraclitus is listening not to me, but to the Logos, wise is agreement that all is one. And the agreeing is same saying, homolegen. It's just the same in front of the word Logos, right? So don't listen to me, listen to the Logos. The Logos says agreement, all is one, right? So it already has this connotation of the order written into the fabric of things, even in its first philosophical use in Heraclitus. And what happens is that understanding of it gets used by the Stoa, not by the Platonists particularly, but it gets used by the Stoa to be turned into something like a notion of providence. It's the order in the world that is providential. It is the providential reason ordering the universe to the Stoa. And that's a settled meaning before the time of Philo from the Stoic tradition. Philo is turning it into something which is more like a theological principle, but there's already this philosophical notion of something like a reason or order in things that the pagan philosophers are on about. The Stoa are not simply not theological, but they're more pantheist theological. They have a god, but they're basically pantheists in this regard. But that reason or order in things is a supreme principle to them. Okay, and then what you see in Philo is him saying, of course you see that ordering principle in the Logos because the architect put it there, right? The architect of that order is the intelligent designer of that order, right? And that is the one of the characters or manifestations of God. God manifested in the order of the wisdom of God manifested in the order of creations is what William Paley called it, right? That's, you know, that notion is there in Philo, and he will call it Logos and link it to Logos because he's appealing back to that Stoic understanding. Does that help?
Yes, but now then, if the use of Logos in that meaning is really more Stoic than Platonic,
Yes.
does it actually also have a role in Platonism?
Logos doesn't have a central role in Platonism. The place where you see it used much more theologically, obviously, is in John. John turning it into something which was a person of the Trinity and there from the foundations of the world, right, is something which you might see echoes of in Philo, but that this theological character of the order of the world is one of the faces or persons of God. That's John, right? Maybe a few previous echoes of it in Philo, but the theological understanding of that is John. It's original. It's not coming from something else.
But in a sense, that dressing of Logos into a theological usage in John has a certain reminiscence to wisdom in the Old Testament. And
sure, I mean, you can find echoes that, as I said, you can find echoes of that in the Old Testament. You can find echoes of that in Philo's interpretation of those things in the Old Testament. You can find versions of there being an ordering principle in things in Platonism as opposed to the Stoa, but they didn't particularly call it Logos and make it a key principle. Calling it Logos and making it a key rational principle of the ordered whole is Stoicism. And turning that into something which is more personally theological is a Christian innovation with some precursors in Philo only.
okay.
Yeah, Joe?
When we were reading Jonas or finishing up the Jonas book on Gnosticism, a distinction was introduced between how the Greeks pre-Christian, earlier had this idea that the cosmos itself was the thing that had.
Yes, cosmos itself was order. Yes, the word cosmos itself means something like order or beautifulness.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, does that feed into the Philo, what you were just discussing? Because
partially. I mean, to say that something is a cosmos, to say that it is already ordered, and to say that it contains an ordering logos or reason, those were certainly things which were assimilated by people like the Stoa, right? But the fact that they called it logos, the fact that they, made it an abstract principle of a universal reason, right? That's their particular doctrine. That the idea that there is a single governing, semi-divine universal reason that governs the whole is a Stoic doctrine that would be completely familiar to Benjamin Franklin or any other deist, right? And that's the kind of principle they were thinking of. That's why they're often thought of as being pantheist, but not actively theist, because they're not thinking of this thing as, they are thinking of it as a reason, but they're not thinking of it as a person, right? As for there just being an ordered cosmos in the first place, you get that in the not just in the Stoa, but in the Platonists and the Aristotelians, right? It's more universal than just the Stoa, but the Stoa are the ones that call it logos.
Well, even today in the moderns, I think I hate to use that word, but think of the universe as having that kind of order that emerges from the laws of physics, gravitation, electromagnetism, things like that. And that would be, and since those things are primarily understood also through mathematical modeling of them,
yes,
that's definitely reason being stuck in.
Yes. It's something like a reason of nature that we would call physical law is very close to what the Stoics were talking about, except they thought of it as even more rational than that, right? Whereas there's a considerable tendency in the modern world to think of that in a, if I can put it this way, a more mechanical way, right? Partly that's because the modern thinks that they can understand rational things mechanically, right? We have reasoning machines, right, which we're using to talk to each other right now. But you know, which isn't there yet, right, in the ancients. But yes, the live according to nature, logos governing the whole being a cosmos, all of those are equivalent things for the Stoics.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the distinction. I'm not sure I have it correctly stated here, but the distinction between a reason for as opposed to a reason to. Anyway, the reason for is when you can understand by explaining the behavior of something you're observing, and you figure out the reason for this behavioral pattern.
But there's a simpler thing going on in the Stoic case. They're just recognizing that it is ordered, that it is reasoned, right? That it is rational, predictable, ordered, uniform, etc., law-like, as opposed to chaotic, willful, random, right? Those are all the synonyms that they're denying when they say there is a logos governing the whole. They're saying it's not just chaos. They're saying it's not just random. They're saying it's not just will or willful gods playing with things, right? All of those are being rejected in favor of a uniform principle of order. Good question.
I'm reminded of when I was about 10 years old. I remember looking up at the stars, although that was not what was making me think something, but I just came to the sensation in my own conclusion that there is order in the universe, not chaos, but order in the universe. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, first it was a childish, well, very, very young pre-knowledge claim that, that was occurring to me. But it strikes me as this is what we're coming back to. This, I was right, I guess.
Well, yes, and not only that. That's also when Craig was pointing out that Romans 1:20 was not really a negative theology verse. That's what he's saying too, right? That's what Philo is saying, right? And so the real question is, what can you deduce from the fact that there is order in the universe, right? And there are more heroic and less heroic versions of answers to that question. The more heroic ones are, so some ordering architectural mind put it there, right? And that's what you get in Philo, right? But that there is enough order in creation that it's the footprints of something, pretty much all of them in traditions that we're talking about, at least, are agreed upon.
That sounds like the distinction between intelligent design and those that don't agree about intelligent design. Evolution.
Yes, there's no question that Philo is an intelligent designer, so to speak. He's an intelligent design advocate, right? As were a lot of people in his day, without calling it that.
So here's a sort of silly thought for you perhaps at the conclusion of this discussion. I suspect that Greeks living on small little parcels of land next to the great sea that surrounded all of their dwellings had a chance to look at the stars and deduce that order exists, whereas the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians living by great river valleys like we Chinese would be subjected to floods that you could not predict, and order and chaos were part of the problem of the universe.
Well, I'm going to partly disagree with you because even the Nile worshipping Egyptians had their notion of cosmic dependence and all these kinds of things. But yeah, I don't know if night sky is the best the best place to start, but all civilizations have confronted order and chaos. Let's put it that way. Almost all of the basic metaphysical myths are, their core terms are order and chaos in one version or another. Usually also mapped to male and female, but because if you've got a distinction, why not reuse it, right? Right. Okay. So let's talk about next time. It sounds like we do want to go over the stuff on Augustine again in some greater detail. I've laid out what I think his basic positive conception is, but we'll go through what's there in the chapter. But for the rest of it, we're just going to finish the whole book for next time. There's a short section of epilogue, which is mostly just about her summing up. Did she sustain her thesis or not? Did she manage to prove her point or not? And not that it's not a deep thing, but the other two important people we're getting are the Pseudo-Dionysius and Scottish Eriugena. And Pseudo-Dionysius is probably the single most pure version of the negative theology in this whole tradition. He's where you get, the true negative theology all the way, not partial approaches to it, not some things which might have led up to it, but the full bore thing that we think of as negative theology. That's Dionysius. And we've already talked a little bit in the past about his actual positioning. It's presented as reasonings of one of the people who talked to one of the apostles in Athens, and therefore backdated to that period, but it's probably from the 400s AD, and therefore not quite 100 years after both Gregory and Augustine on that order, roughly contemporary with Proclus. So that's roughly the time that it is, we think. And there's several works from him that are worth looking at, but yeah, the heavenly hierarchy, divine names, and the mystical theology. There's also things about mysticism, but probably the divine names and the mystical theology are his most important ones, but also he has the heavenly hierarchy. So what are we going to get? We're going to get a version of Christian theology about questions like the Trinity, questions about the nobility or unknowability of God, all the negative theology stuff we've been talking about, from a Christian tradition that's already been informed by all of Neoplatonism, right? And you can see it as being alongside contemporary with Proclus. As I say, in a way, it's the most developed. It's also willing to be the most mystical, or at times the most obscure of these Christian ones. The one we're going to get after that is hundreds of years later, off in the West with Scotus Eriugena, not to be confused with Duns Scotus, who's way later. This is, he's a Irish monk living in France at the court of the French kings after Charlemagne, and he is reading the Cappadocian Fathers and Dionysius, and he is translating them from Greek into Latin so that all of the newly recultured, previously barbarians of the Northwestern European Latin world or Latin reading world can learn about all of this highfalutin Eastern theology, so to speak. He's a very learned man. He knows tons of Platonism and Neoplatonism. He knows all of these guys cold. In a way, he is a more rational and neatly ordered mind than Dionysus, I would say. Maybe a little bit less mystical. He's a more systematic thinker, if I can put it that way, but probably a little bit less original as well. But he's the last one we'll consider in the period, and that's taking us up to. We haven't gotten to the high scholastics. We haven't gotten to the era of Averroes and Thomas Aquinas and all the kind of stuff we saw in Gilson, but we've got everything of importance in the medieval period before then, basically. There are some other things that happen along the way outside of this tradition, people like Anselm and so forth, but between the two perhaps. But this is giving us the transmission mechanisms of this kind of negative theology into that high Middle Ages scholastic period. Now, there are other things which we don't get into in this that come after that. Probably the single most important would be someone like Meister Eckhart, who comes a little bit after that period, who is also kind of in this negative theology tradition or this mystical tradition related to it. He's influenced by all these people, but because he's also passed through all of that rich scholastic stuff, she's basically left him out here. As you can't put in a history like this all the things which might have influenced Meister Eckhart if they have to include the entire history of the scholastics. So she doesn't try. She just ends with Scottish Eriugena, and that gives you all the influences on them as opposed to the influences later. Okay. In terms of what they're like to read, I mean, Pseudo Dionysus is encyclopedic, sometimes repetitious. He does argue. His arguments are always have an appearance of cogency, but they're not always all that forceful. He reminds of Proclus in many ways, I would say. Whereas Scotus Eriugena is a tidier, more systematic thinker, if I can put it that way. He's going to give you a fourfold division of all the things in nature. He's going to give you a careful distinction between what he means by the nature of something and what we mean by its essence or being. He's going to relate all these things back to how these things were used previously, scholastically, so to speak. In some ways, he reminds me of Aquinas in terms of the fact that he's one of these systematic, careful, encyclopedic thinkers. I'm talking about Scottish Eriugena. But I think it's fair to say not as original as Dionysus the Areopagite. Okay, that's just some preview of things to look for in them. The other things to look for in Dionysus is the towers of his hierarchy, how far off into the Neoplatonic ether his concepts are going to go, and what you'll find at the top of it. And it is also useful to think of that in terms of both what it might mean for mysticism and also any echoes of the Gnostics. Which you wouldn't find in someone like Gregory, who is intensely concerned with remaining orthodox and avoiding any of the ambient dangerous heresies. You won't find that kind of care or concern or cautiousness, if I can put it that way, in Dionysus. He's a much more adventurous, innovative thinker. Okay, that's just previews of what we're going to get in the last two. The other thing we'll talk about next time is just summing up anything about what we've learned from the whole book, and also for next time, bring any things you might want to investigate next. Joe, you had a question.
Yes, as we're closing now, and I have a question basically for you, Jason, off topic. Have you ever heard of this book or this philosopher?
Absolutely. I know the book very well. We can talk about it in a second, but I want to get to when we're going to meet next. Then we can go talk about Kripke. So the times I could do, I'm going to be up in Sedona for the week of Thanksgiving, but I'll be back by the 28th. So I could do the 28th if people are available on November 28th. Or is that bad for you, Craig?
Not so worried about the other group anymore. I've kind of
Okay.
lost interest in it.
Okay, so let's plan on doing this 3 weeks from now, November the 28th, the remainder of the book and your thoughts for next time. So Joe, you want to talk about Kripke, Naming a Necessity?
I just wanted to ask, I haven't read the book.
Yes.
Is it forward or backwards to you?
It's forward. I can read it. It's forward.
Okay.
It's a good book. It's a good book. But sorry, you had particular questions about it?
It was mentioned in the other philosophy discussion group I participate in.
Yeah.
It was recommended by one person as a future book for that group.
Okay.
And it just crossed my mind that when I was reading Gregory,
Okay.
that placing names correctly into things was apparently something that he valued.
There are. I mean, Augustine in particular is a conventionalist about naming, or about linguistics generally, and closer to what Kripke is about. Kripke is in the tradition of analytic philosophy, typically thought of as English American analytic philosophy. In the 20th century, in academia particularly, he has a definite place in that. I would describe his place as the following. He made metaphysical models respectable again. And the way he did it was by showing that some of the ideas about how tidy and pat explanations could be in the positivist school wouldn't actually work, because the way in which language makes its connections to the external reality about which it is trying to make claims necessarily involves metaphysical commitments. That's my short capsule version of what that book is about. But it's very carefully argued. It's trying to make a relatively limited point to establish that bigger result. Some people will say, does it really establish that bigger result if it's making so careful a point? And that's debatable, right? But I think that was his motivation for doing it. And he manages to establish his limited point, his careful limited point very well, in my opinion. I think that's why it's important. But Sam, you got a comment on Kripke?
Yeah, sorry, you're asking who was the author being mentioned?
Kripke, Naming a Necessity,
okay.
by Saul Kripke.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, off topic for everything we're talking about here. Just but it is an interesting. If you're interested in that sort of analytic philosophy, he's an important character just to know the trajectory that analytic philosophy went in the 20th century, because kind of before him, anything that smacked of anything like metaphysics was considered right out. That's something those continentals do, and we analytic philosophers don't take that sort of stuff seriously because it can never be made rigorous. And Kripke was like, no, actually, even your theories of language are going to need it, and your theories of science are going to need it, and your theories of language aren't going to touch your theories of science unless you have one. And after that, people started talking about possible worlds in ways that were acknowledged to be involve metaphysical commitments. Let's put it that way. So in that sense, Kripke is the guy who made metaphysics respectable again in the 1970s or so. In analytic philosophy, obviously in continental philosophy, they never had this problem to begin with, because they were never quite conceited enough to think that they could think without metaphysics. Well, except maybe they could get out of the end of metaphysics if they're post-Heideggerians or something. But you get the point. They didn't. This is an intramural problem in analytic philosophy, that it has that degree of implication. I mean, but the points that he makes about language and reasoning are sound regardless of what tradition you're in. So in that sense, it's a useful philosophy book regardless. Okay, fine question. So we will, I'll do this recording. Sorry, we've made this recording. I'll put it up on YouTube sometime later tonight after some all its processing and such. And look forward to seeing you guys in 3 weeks for the rest of this book.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.